Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tony Payan. I am the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy.
Yeah, open it. Yeah.
It is a pleasure to welcome you to this virtual conference this morning. It is also encouraging to have so many people attending, well over 200 people this morning. This speaks to the importance of the issue of immigration for all of us, for our organizations, and of course, for our country. Thank you so much. To begin our event, I want to acknowledge first and foremost our funder, the Charles Koch Foundation, for the generous support of our immigration initiative here at the Baker Institute. There's one thing that we share with the Koch Foundation that I want to say, and that is to remove barriers that prevent people from reaching their potential. And second, I want to thank our partners who are organizing this conference with us today, the Center for Houston's Future here in Houston, Texas, and of course, the Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. So what brings us today here to this virtual conference? The issue of immigration. Again, I should say, for over 2 decades, I have followed closely all the national and local debates on immigration. I have seen all the arguments. I have heard all sides. I have seen all the data. I have contemplated all the angles, and I have visualized all perspectives on this key issue for our country. And I have empathized with many of them for and against immigration. And as they say, I guess this horse has been beaten to death. And yet here we are again, revisiting this issue for the umpteenth time. And of course, what we want to do is continue to push for immigration reform in our country because we understand the vitality of this issue for us today, for our economy, for our society, for our demographics. And this because despite the fact that this issue has been researched extensively and that we know all the facts so deeply and that we understand that it is of utmost importance for our country, here we are talking again about this issue, and we will continue to do so under our political leaders who have been gridlocked and unable to do something about this key issue since the 1990s. The last immigration bill that we saw was in 1996, and before that, 1986. So we continue as a country to be gridlocked on this particular issue, and we need to really unleash the potential that immigration represents for our nation. So today, we'll have another good conversation, and then after we are done here, I invite all of us to talk to our Congress members and our senators to see if we can push them towards action on immigration reform. So why have yet another conversation, you may ask? And we talk because we want to go from the world of ideas to the world of action. And we will not rest talking and researching and joining hands until this issue is resolved, because it is of vital importance to all of us, our city, our state, and our country. And so to set an example of how we want to engage the policymaking community, our political leaders, we have today the pleasure of receiving one of our important guests this morning. That is Judge K.P. George of Fort Bend County. Let me tell you a little bit about Judge K.P. George, who's joining us this morning. On January the 1st, 2019, Judge K.P. George was elected to serve as Fort Bend County Judge. Fort Bend, for those of you who are joining us from afar, is near Houston, near Harris County, where Houston is located. It's part of the metropolitan area of the Houston region. As the county's top elected official, Judge George presides over the Commissioner's Court, which oversees the county's more than 3,000 employees and its nearly $300 million budget. Additionally, Judge George is the director of the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Since taking office, Judge George has placed a very heavy focus on Homeland Security and emergency management, transparency in government, youth empowerment, and improving the quality of life for citizens in the county. Judge George is the first Fort Bend County judge of South Asian descent. Prior to running for public office, George was a board-certified financial planner in Sugar Land, Texas, near Houston. His passion for education and cultivating leadership in children led to his decision to run for Fort Bend Independent School District School Board in Fort Bend, of which where he served 2 terms from 2014 to 2018. Under the leadership of Judge George, the county has enjoyed many positives since he took office in 2019. He has successfully managed the COVID-19 crisis, which has affected all of us throughout. So without further ado, let me welcome Judge KP George. He will address the issue of immigration. And this is of particular importance because Judge George is what we would call a suburban county executive. And that means that immigration has now moved from a pure concern for cities like Dallas and Houston and Atlanta and New York and Los Angeles or Chicago, all the way to the suburbs, places like Fort Bend, where immigrants continue now to play a very important role in their well-being and their growth and their economic prosperity. And so let me welcome Judge George to give us his remarks, and then he and I will engage in conversation. So please, Judge George, go ahead.
Good morning, Tony, and it's very nice to hear from you. And you put it so eloquently, the importance of immigration. I am a standing example of immigration because I immigrated to this country 28 years ago when I was already an adult, and I came to this country because this is a dreamland for millions of people all over the world, and they wanted to come here. They wanted to come here and contribute to make this country continue to be a better place. Yeah, do you see some bad people? Yeah, that's everywhere. But the thing about it is, I'm an example of immigration, what it can do for our country. And I always say this, instead of saying I am an Indian American, no, I am an American of Indian descent. And I specifically correct that to people because I sometimes feel like, I'm not sometimes feel like I hold the naturalization certificate. A lot of people don't even understand. If you are born and raised, you don't even understand what it is. It is a certificate they give it to us when you take the oath to be a citizen of this country and follow the rules and constitution and things of that nature. And I hold it very close to my heart. And I say I have this degree or that degree, but to become a citizen of this country is maybe the most important thing in my life ever happened. So being said that, people need to understand that immigration is a discussion. We all, like you said, there are both sides. Some people say, we don't want any more people. Some people say the other way. And so the point I wanted to make is the desire to provide for your children, the desire to have a better life, the desire to have, live in a society with dignity is something nobody can take it away from you, because that's the reason why people walk in the Arizona desert. Some of them never make it. And that's why you see people coming from Cuba, jumping on a piece of wood, try to cross the ocean. That's why you see from North Africa to Europe, people get on a piece of, like 2, 3, 4 pieces of wood put together and go to the other side because the desire to provide the better life for them and people around them. So being said that, and I always said this, Fort Bend County is the most ethnically diverse county according to the new census. And we have around, this number is a little bit older, 2017 numbers showing we have 29.6% of Fort Bend residents are foreign born, 29.6%. And I could almost guarantee that that's now, close to 1/3. And these people are contributing to make our country, our our county, our state, our country a better place. They paid, almost $660 million in 2017 in taxes, and they contributed 11 to 12 billion dollars to Fort Bend County's GDP, and their buying power was $7 billion, which is equal to 36% of Fort Bend County's total buying power. So don't tell me immigration is a bad thing for us. And so I understand the whole world wanted to come here. Maybe we cannot accommodate everybody, but that's why Tony, you rightfully mentioned, because this is a hot potato. Whether it is Republican or Democrat, they all wanted to pass it on to the next guy and say, the other guy is the bad person. But I think it is time for us to address the immigration issue. It's time for us to create some kind of a comprehensive policy when it comes to immigration. And so you saw that people, a lady was throwing her child to an American soldier in Afghanistan over the fence. This is heartbreaking, people. I mean, if somebody wanted to talk about, we shouldn't have anybody and everybody here, I have news for you, and I could talk to them, because, I talk to people when I travel the world, and I talk to people and talk to young people, and they decide to get a better education. And that is what we are talking about. So point is, how do you balance it? And that is the key. And I don't think those who are not believing immigration is a good thing, I just wanted to say, it's all how you look at it. And many, many times, that around 10 plus million, maybe 11 or 12 million people undocumented live in this country. Yeah, there are so many ways it is, we need to address that issue. But at the same time, they are also, I understand maybe many of them doesn't pay an income tax, but they all pay a consumption tax, which is sales tax, anything you buy. And that is billions of dollars worth of money. And also they're taking a lot of jobs. Many times Americans don't want to do it. And so they are adding value to this community. And how do you bring an order to this discussion? And that is the key. And when you are not documented, you don't know who is coming and who is not, who is around you and all that stuff. So there should be some kind of a system in place. But I tell you, I don't think, and we always talk about, I remember listening to President Clinton. He said, we are a nation of immigrants. And I'm sure you all heard this. And the only thing is, I always, if somebody talked to me anything bad about immigration, hey, you came a little bit early and I came a little bit late. That's the only difference. And this is the place where we all wanted to call home, and we wanted to address. Tony, I could keep talking, but I will just maybe stop here. And if you have any specific question, maybe I could address. But this is a very passionate issue for me, close to my heart issue, because when I travel and I see this. People wanted to come here, and even the people right now we have refugees coming from Afghanistan. These people are educated people who helped our soldiers, and so we cannot look at immigrants or refugees as bad people, and they are vetted. They are all. I mean, anytime I work with a lot of organizations provide assistance to refugees. They are vetted for years, and it's not just overnight. They just bring them here and release into the society. And so these all people, and one way or other, they are going to be adding value to our community and making our community continue to be a better place. According to Kinder Institute, I was talking to Dr. Kleinberg. He said our county, Fort Bend County, is, like I said, most ethnically diverse county, 29% white, 24% Hispanic, 22.5% Asians, and 20.5% African American. So we believe we celebrate our diversity, and we believe it is important for us to set a stage, set a standard, so that the rest of our country, when they get there, and we have a better society, an inclusive society, and a society can add value to everybody and make our community better, and teaching our children about inclusiveness and being together, and that only going to add value, things of that nature. So, like I said, it is very close to my heart and passionate issue, and I will just if you have any specific questions or something, and I will stop here. But this is something we need to talk. We need to, more we talk, somebody will listen, somebody will, more we advocate, somebody will pay attention to it. Thank you for doing this, and I really, really appreciate your effort.
Thank you, Judge George. Let me, if you don't mind, engage 10, 15 minutes in conversation on this issue. I hail from West Texas, far West Texas, and there is a small county, Loving County, population 92.
Yeah, I know that.
Fort Bend County was mostly a sleepy, rural, small county in the outskirts of Houston, Texas, way out there. And now you're reaching almost 1 million people, 900,000 people.
Yeah.
Like you said, very diverse, suburban county, thriving, diverse. Can you tell us a little bit about the role that immigration has played and it's playing in suburban America, not urban America, because I think people in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, they already value immigration. They live with immigrants day to day. So the developing story is really about suburban America. And Fort Bend is just that story. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got there?
Yeah. Tony, I hope you didn't leave Loving County. That means when you leave, it is going to be 91 people. Don't leave. And so we talk about it. I always, I like geography and I like history and all that stuff. And I looked it up and I remember that county. So thank you. I never met somebody from there, so now I know. Tony lived there. So answer your question. Yes, our story is a unique one. How we can be a better America. That's what it is. 52,000 people in the 1970 census, established in 1837, and had all kinds of stories. And this is interesting thing. Our county had all kinds of stories, after, Emancipation Declaration. And that in Texas, slaves never even knew for 2 more years they were free. And so now we have a Juneteenth, first time we actually celebrated the courthouse this year. So then, of course, after the election, a couple of African Americans got elected in the 1870s, and then they had to run for their life. And this is the rest of the life they lived outside of the county. And then they established something called a white-only primary, which existed until 1953 in Fort Bend County. And so when Supreme Court said it is unconstitutional, and so the same county you're talking today, the most diverse county, and that is a success story because one thing is we see continued, and during this COVID time, we were able to do a lot of good work. COVID is a bad thing, happened to so many people. So many people lost their life, but Fort Bend County is thriving in the middle of it because more than 98% of our 65 and up got at least one shot. 92% is fully vaccinated, and 76% 12 and up got one shot, and 72% is fully vaccinated. So it is actually giving a lot of impression out there, people, hey, this county care about people, and this county. And so now our problem is we don't have enough inventory home to sell in Fort Bend County. And I never heard this. People are paying about the asking price to get the homes and things of that. I never heard that happen in Texas generally. And so it's happening simply because our success with managing COVID and caring for the people and celebrating our diversity. And, we started doing, the Islamic art celebration. Now, first time in the courthouse, we celebrated Hispanic Heritage Month, and then Indian Diwali event, and, you name it. All this stuff, because we are doing it, we wanted to feel, our citizens wanted to feel we care about them. We care about them. They are part of this county. They are living in a society where they're valued. And that is the most important thing. And also, I don't know, this immigrants, somebody say this or that about immigration, and, our immigrant community is, what is that? Almost 33% of our engineering community come from immigrant background. 27% of the mathematicians and statisticians come from immigration background, computer scientists. And you know that the doctors, you know, any one of you go to doctor, you all have at least an Indian doctor kind of thing. You know, the second largest medical population, doctor population come from Indian background. So these all people are not, coming here to take something from us. You know, of course they are here to work and make a better life. And so these all people are adding 100% value to our community. 7.5% of foreign-born citizens are, in small business. They are self-employed, and 700. This is a whopping number. 776 billion annually. The business is created. The immigrant businesses revenue is almost 770. Talking about $750 billion in revenues. That's huge. That is huge. So this is all why I'm saying all this stuff. These are our story. A piece of that happening in Fort Bend County, and some of the richest people I know in Fort Bend County came in the 70s to this country just to go to school, or like I know somebody who came to go to UH, and he started working at a Burger King. Today he owns 500 Burger Kings in all this region. So I'm just saying, and that opportunity came from our system, America, but at the same time he is a contributing member for this society. And so this is the reason why our tolerance and our inclusiveness is one of the reasons why people continue to move to counties like ours and continue to thrive.
Yeah. So Judge George, you and I are members of the choir. We understand it, we see it, we study it, we view it. We got the numbers with the statistics. We got the sense of the importance of immigration for our demographics, for our economy, for our the value of our diversity as a nation, and on and on. And yet, and by the way, many who are in the political world, many who are opposed to immigration, may even acknowledge it privately. But this has not translated into action on immigration and fixing our broken system. And broken is a word that's thrown around quite a bit, but I think it's very true. There's a reason why it's used a lot. You have a political gene in you. So tell me, why is it that we, despite what I mentioned in the beginning, which is we got the numbers, we got the value, we got the whole picture, we understand it, why can't we get it to the floor of the Senate, the floor of the House? Why can't we get it to be a normalized speech among our politicians, from the governor all the way down to the mayors and county judges and on to Congress? What do you see? What's the difficulty here? Why has it become so gridlocked that we can't seem to translate our ideas into action?
Simple. I mean, because one thing is actually during COVID, and especially after George Floyd's death, and I see that there is more political activism. I see that people coming out, young people coming out. My 18-year-old daughter, and she said, she first time voted in the primary runoff and the general election. She is in Austin. She said, no, I don't want to put my ballot in the mail, so I'm going to come to Houston to vote. So answer your question, I think we are not holding these people enough accountable. And you saw that the way politicians are created in a system, like, for example, you saw that what happened in the special session at the State House, in Austin, they gerrymander these districts. It is safe. I mean, whether they listen to you or not, they are only worried about the primary, not general election. And this is the wrong thing happening in our country. And, politicians drawing their own line, own boundary. And what kind of boundary I'm going to draw if I have my power to draw that? And so this is a joke. I mean, living in, born and raised in somewhere else, this is a joke. I never heard of this, and the United States is maybe the only place do like that. And some states already moved away from it. And so you asked me a question, how do we And I think we have to hold these people accountable. We have to collectively engage these people. And also, but the sad thing is they're only worried about their primary. And you tell me, how do we fix that problem? Because when I'm only worried about my primary, if you are a right-wing thought process person, they are not worried about immigration. They think immigration is a bad thing. And so if I only need to cater to my base, so how we are going to get that person's attention? And it is a hard one. And so first of all, I think, but we came a long way though. And I'm not feeling we are completely, I'm not talking about immigration, but in general, we came a long way. There are more engagement from the community. There is more engagement from people, and especially minorities. There are more engagement. The last couple of elections have shown that, and I hope they don't go back to sleep. And I answer your question, it is only way we are engaging. Politicians are only going to pay attention when their existence is threatened. Mm-hmm. And so when that happens, they will pay attention. And so how do you do it? And we collectively, and our young, I see that there is a lot of young people are engaging, and that all gives me hope. How do we do it immediately? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe you have a better answer.
One more question, Judge, before I let you go, because I know you have another commitment. One of the things that I acknowledge is that there is a lot of fear in this country. Look, our economy is not doing poorly. Our society is not really a bad place to be. You and I acknowledge that, and we recognize it. And yet there's so much apprehension and anxiety and fear in the air. It seems to me that we need some sort of collective therapy as a nation sometimes. And I know there's a lot of anxiety in that, that quarter European descendant population in your county, and the 40%, 45% European descendant population in Texas, and on in the United States. How can we get to the point at which diversity is not a source of anxiety and fear, but a source of pride and something that we stand by and that we value and appreciate because it enriches our lives? How can we assuage the fear that a lot of the population feels, the uncertainty about the future, about change, about demographic change? And I say that because, in Texas, 98% of demographic change in the last 10 years came from minorities. And that makes people very nervous, especially in rural counties. Suburban counties are waking up to that fact. Your county is one of them. Urban counties like Harris, we already know and understand it and value. How can we get those counties to the other side of Fort Bend? Not here in Houston, and then your county next, and then but the rural county behind that. Sure. How do we get them to say, relax, we look at us, we are minorities, we are engaged, we're bringing value? What is in the environment? How would you address those fears?
I tell you, that's actually a good, good question. And also how you feel is your feeling. Some people feel threatened. We have to acknowledge that. And so unfortunately, some political forces is feeding into their fear. And that is actually, you saw that last 4 or 5 years. That's what we saw, feeding into their fear. And that's the reason why we are actually doing in Fort Bend County. We engaged our citizens. We are engaging our citizens. We are celebrating our diversity. And first time, I tell you, there is a lady coming from Hispanic background. She came to our courthouse, and we recognized her for her contribution because she worked. She did a lot of things. She was in the late 70s. She was an elected member of a city council in Fort Bend. Coming from a Hispanic background is a big accomplishment because nobody was really, at the time it was a fight. And so we acknowledge and we recognized her in that event, and she was kind of crying because she felt it never happened. And, nobody talk about, 24% of Hispanics in this county. And I said, you know what, you exist, you're here, and your contributions are important to me and important to us. And one thing day one, I took office and I said, I believe in human dignity. And I'm not going to look at if God created somebody, there is a reason in this world for them. And I have no right to tell them they are good or bad. I mean, that's not my role. And I can only look at them, see what I can do to help them. So how do you engage? Because I'm reading a book called How to Talk to a Person Doesn't Look Like You. So that's the problem here. And, and even today, Tony, I tell you, some of the people look at me after 3 years in office. They look at me like I'm an alien. And some people cannot, it's hard for them to change. And some people are coming around. And I made every attempt to reach out to people. And I continue to do that, reach out to people and talk into them and say, hey, I'm here to help. Maybe I don't look like you, but that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. Or anyone look like me is a bad person. And that is my thought. And I will continue to do that. And also one thing finally, my staff said, I like to touch this, DACA, about the people who came here as kids. I'm a big supporter of DACA giving a path to citizenship. The kids came here as infants. And I talked to at least 10 of those DACA recipients and many people. And they're telling me, Mr. George, I don't know what Mexico looked like. I've never been there. This is the country I lived in. This is the country maybe I'm not born here. This is the country I started speaking English. English is my first language. Of course, I speak Spanish. So I just want you to know that those who are listening, I'm a big supporter of DACA. And answer your question, we are doing a lot of things to engage our Caucasian population and others. We are celebrating our diversity on a regular basis, and we will continue to learn what we can do more. Nothing we do is about one person or two person. It's about a collective effort, creating a country, creating a state, creating a county can benefit and can, add value to citizens, and also making our citizens, doesn't matter what they look like, proud. Making the citizens proud. That's my goal. And we all can collectively continue to do that. And, Tony, when you take this fight to the next level, count me in. I will go with you. And if I need to do something, go and advocate with our state or, in Washington, D.C. or whatever, I will do it, because this is something, this conversation has to happen. We can only, so far, we pushed it, you can only kick the can so far. And, the can is, there is nowhere to kick anymore. This is there. And we are there. So we need to address it. So, and I appreciate you asked me to say a few words, and those who are listening. And I just want you to know this is an amazing discussion. And I'm so glad you asked me to say a few words. And I'm being an immigrant myself. And I believe this is an amazing nation. And we all need to hold this thing together. And while we are, celebrating our diversity and differences, and that's my goal. And I will be available every step of the way, if anything I can do to make that effort better.
Thank you, Judge George. Thank you for your words, and thank you for bringing this to the fore, this conversation, because you represent a county that in the past was so foreign and so strange to all of us, the suburban world, and yet the future is here, and the future is suburban. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and please come by the Baker Institute anytime in the future. Come and visit us. Hopefully the next conversation will be in person, and we'll get you here.
Will do. Thank you, sir.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to Judge George for his words. And as you can see, Fort Bend County is a suburban county outside Houston. That is, as I said, the future. Those are the counties outside Washington, D.C., outside Atlanta, Georgia, outside Houston, Texas, outside Phoenix, that are beginning to make a difference, because that is where now immigration is thriving. So let me now go on with our program and introduce our two panels today. All the speakers you will hear over the next 2 hours in today's program come from a diverse set of organizations, all of us working together and all convinced that we need immigration reform, and we've needed it for a very long time. All of us continuously interacting with each other, weaving together an ever broader coalition of thinkers and organizations pushing for fixing our broken immigration system. You will hear from our Rice University's Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico Scholars. You will hear from the Cato Institute. You will hear from the National Immigration Forum. You will hear from the New American Economy. You will hear from Forward US, and you will hear from the Bipartisan Policy Center and from the Migration Policy Institute. All of us, think tanks, organizations, groups, scholars, thinking very hard about this issue. You will also hear from our partners, as I mentioned, the Center for Houston's Future, and of course, the Bush Institute in Dallas. That's quite a group joining us together, joining us today to talk about this important issue. This is a great coalition. There's also a lot of business people behind it and foundations as well, like the Koch Foundation, our partners financing this project, with whom we share that idea that we need to remove the barriers to achieve full human potential. We have great ideas, and we are very excited in what they all have to say, all these different representatives of all these different think tanks and groups and research centers. So please stay with us over the next 2 hours. We're certain that you will gain great knowledge, data, and of course, witness a very good discussion on this topic. By the way, let me also mention our two moderators now, Brett Perlman from the Center for Houston's Future, who will moderate the next panel. I've worked with Brett on this particular issue in the rational middle, and under the great leadership of Stan Marek in Houston on this very issue for several years now. And of course, Laura Collins over at the Bush Institute's SMU Economic Initiative in Dallas, co-organizers with this panel. Thank you again, you guys, for your great work. And they will lead our next two panels, Brett the first and Laura the second, and then we'll come back with our concluding remarks. And also, I want to remind you before I hand the microphone over to Brett Perlman to handle the next panel, that you can participate too. At the very center of your screen, the bottom of the center of your screen, there is a feature called Q&A. So please participate, submit your questions under the Q&A feature, and our moderators will actually grab the questions out of there, and they will bring them to the panelists. So don't remember, this is an interactive conversation. There's a lot of you out there watching today, well over 100 people, and you will also be able to see the video recording of this event in the future if you need to. So without further ado, let me introduce Brett Perlman, a great friend and partner of the center here. Brett Perlman is the president and CEO of the Center for Houston's Future. Earlier, in another life, Perlman was a consultant with McKinsey & Company, and he practiced law in major firms in Houston and Washington, D.C. Perlman received a bachelor's degree in honors from Northwestern University, a master's in public policy from Harvard, and a JD from the University of Texas at Austin Law School. That's quite a curriculum. Brett, the next panel is all yours. We'll hope to have a really good conversation.
Hi, Tony. Thank you very much. And hopefully maybe at one point I'll get one of those degrees from Rice in the future. For those of you who don't know us, the Center for Houston's Future is a 20-year-old nonprofit which focuses on looking over the horizon at national and global issues and their local impact. We've been working with our partners at the Baker Institute since 2008, and more recently with the George W. Bush Institute, since we all believe in the imperative of reforming the nation's immigration system and on the need to create a new dialogue on immigration. Last May, we held a workshop with many of the country's foremost immigration experts on the state of immigration in the United States and the opportunities in the then new Biden administration to create a consensus on realistic, politically feasible immigration reforms. But it became clear from the discussion at the workshop that a bipartisan approach was unlikely, that there was not a clear path to achieve immigration reform with only a Democratic majority in the House and Senate, and that it might be better to proceed with piecemeal legislation. Since then, legislative solutions have remained tantalizingly out of touch. it has become apparent that a comprehensive immigration reform solution does not have bipartisan support, and that there's not a clear formula to push any immigration reform through the Senate, given the opposition of the Republican Party, the filibuster rule, and the odd rules that govern the reconciliation process. At the same time, we've seen new attention focused on the southern border with large increases in numbers crossing illegally. And we've also been facing large labor shortages and supply chain issues resulting in inflation. And the census has shown that the demographic change that we've all known is occurring has arrived, with minority populations representing a big part of our demographic change. And so it's become apparent that economic growth depends on immigrants. And then yesterday, we had an election where the results showed an increasing concerns about these issues. So the imperative for immigration reform remains high, but the course for change is uncertain as ever. And so that's what we're going to address on this panel. We have four of our leading national experts to discuss this topic with. First, David Beer, who is a research fellow at the Cato Institute. He's an expert on visa reform, border security, interior enforcement, and his work has been cited in the Washington Post, New York Times, and most recently on NPR, which I heard last Saturday. Jeremy Robbins is executive director for the New American Economy, a bipartisan coalition of more than 500 CEOs and mayors making the case for immigration reform. Todd Schultz is president of Forward.us, an organization started in 2013 by key leaders from the technology community to promote policies to keep the United States competitive in a global economy. And finally, Madeline Zavatny is a professor in the Department of Economics and Geology at the University of North Florida and a research fellow at the Institute for Labor Economics and an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. So we have many experts to discuss this issue with, and what we're going to do is give each of them about 8 to 10 minutes to express their points of view, and then that will leave us perhaps 20 minutes for questions. As Tony mentioned, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will get them to them at the end of the discussion. We're going to go in the order of David, Jeremy, Todd, and Madeline. And so, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you for hosting this and moderating the panel. My perspective, first of all, I'm David Beer. I work for the Cato Institute. We're the leading libertarian think tank in the United States. And our perspective is that immigration is good for the country. It's good for the United States, and we should be facilitating more legal immigration. We should not be looking to restrict Americans' rights to interact with people who happen to be born in other countries. And so when we're talking about the enforcement side of the equation, how that plays out is our perspective is America's immigration laws and the enforcement of those laws should maximize the benefits that immigrants can bring to the United States. With that in mind, U.S. immigration enforcement should focus on resolving the violations of the law in ways that benefit the country. Agents should identify infractions with the goal of correcting them, not merely punishing them. Right now, our system prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation, which ultimately perpetuates the infractions into the future, encouraging immigrants to hide in the shadows rather than step forward and try to correct the mistakes. The main way in which our immigration system encourages this right now is through a system of legal immigration that's incredibly constrained and heavy penalties on people who violate those immigration restrictions. And so just to focus on the violations for a second, we have a policy on the books that says that if you violate immigration law and are in the country illegally for more than 1 year, you are banned from obtaining legal status, even if you leave the country for 10 years. This policy encourages illegal immigrants to remain in the country because 10 years is too long to expect people to be separated from home and family The penalty is far too steep for people who have built their lives here to go back and wait out that 10-year restriction. So getting rid of that is the first step towards a healthier, more functioning system where when people identify, okay, I violated the law, I admit that I violated the law, now what do I do about it? You have to have a procedure whereby they can go back and apply for visas the right way. The other anomaly in the immigration system is the fact that when a violation has occurred, there's no statute of limitations on arresting that person, removing them from the country. The fact that you came here decades ago is really irrelevant under immigration law today. So I would propose that we need a statute of limitations. I propose 10 years being a reasonable standard that most Americans would agree to, that if you have been in the country for 10 years, you should be able to adjust to permanent resident status. And it shouldn't be a one-time fix either. We're so focused on, we're going to do this amnesty to end all amnesties. We're going to do this legalization, and we're never going to have to revisit this again. It's a very utopian framework that's not based in reality. We should have an immigration system that focuses all of our enforcement resources on those first few years when after someone first violates immigration law, and not focus on people who the country is never going to rally around deporting people with who have built their lives here for 10 years. So that's two principles that I think we should really be focusing on when we're talking about enforcement, when we're talking about trying to build an immigration system where people can get right with the law. But that's not the end of the reforms. We need to also focus on legal immigration going forward. There needs to be a system that people can go back to, or that people can enter for the first time through. And right now, there really is no such system. If you do not have an immediate family member in the United States, you are not going to be eligible to immigrate here unless you are a very, very select few of highly skilled individuals. For people who are looking to fill other niches in the labor market, there's no path to year-round employment and residence in this country. We have a few seasonal worker programs. They've done great to reduce illegal immigration from Mexico, but the fact that there is not a year-round work visa option for people to fill roles at dairies, at meat processing plants, other industries that are desperately short of workers right now, is ultimately the driving force behind the disaster that we see at the border right now. Regardless of the motivations for people coming to the border, at the end of the day, what finances all of that relocation are jobs north of the border. You can't pay for your trip without the funds, and the funds are coming ultimately from U.S. jobs that immigrants either will be filling or have already filled, and they're sending for their family members. And so this labor market restriction where jobs are going unfilled and ultimately being filled by workers here illegally is the most important policy problem with our immigration system, our legal immigration system right now. And not enough focus is being spent on that. Certainly in the reconciliation bill and other measures that are being put forward by the Democrats completely overlook this issue. And we need to focus on long-term policy solutions and not short-term political solutions. Thank you.
Well, David, great comments. Thanks for starting us off. Jeremy, I'll go to you next.
Sounds great. Thank you, Brett. And thank you to the Baker Institute and to the Bush Center as well, and the Center for Houston's Future for having me. Where you're great partners. I think the work you're doing in this space is extremely important. So, and great to be here with so many old friends. So, I was asked today to speak about demographic trends, or where are we going and how does immigration play into that? And I'm representing New American Economy, which is a think tank and an advocacy organization where we focus on trying to look at the hard data on what's happening in our communities, what role the immigrants play. And so I'll speak about a few economic trends and then and one non-economic demographic trend. And on the economic side, there are a bunch of things that are happening to the American economy where immigration is a huge opportunity, not to solve all of our problems, but to help mitigate them and to help put us on a better foot than any of our competitors abroad. First, like all developed countries, we are getting older and fast. There are 10,000 baby boomers retiring every single day. The average age of Americans is shooting up in every single census. It gets higher and higher and higher. As we have more and more seniors, and note that we're also living longer, there simply aren't enough workers to replace them and to support them. So immigrants aren't going to solve this problem, but they are going to help us in a way that our other developed countries and our peers don't have, right? The fact that when people vote with their feet, they come here to work means that we have people with a diverse set of skills who are coming, and that's going to have hugely positive implications for our workforce, right? If you look at people who are prime working age, or between 16 and 64, it's about 3 in 5 native-born Americans. But if you look at immigrants, it's around 80% of the people who are coming, because people are coming here to work, and that is a huge advantage for Americans. And it's not just that people are coming, but they're coming with a diverse set of skills, because right now in America, we have a huge skills mismatch. And I'm sure you're seeing this. You just walk down the street and every business has a help wanted sign. And it's not just 1 or 2 roles, but it's almost every role. The Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps data on how many jobs are open in America. Over the last couple of months, it's done something it's never done before, and it's past 10 million. There are 10 million open jobs that we can't fill currently in America. And if you look at the industries they're in, healthcare, hospitality, construction, transportation, those are industries which immigrants disproportionately work in. And within those industries, they work in the jobs that are hardest to fill. And so as you think about how we're going to get our economy moving again, how we're going to create jobs that a lot of the Americans that are still on the sidelines are going to take, immigration is a key piece for that. Similarly, we have a locations mismatch, right? Where the jobs are is different from where the workers are. And so the fact that when immigrants come in, they're more mobile, that is a tool that we have to help fill the jobs that we need to get our economy going. Another really important one, which is a very scary demographic trend for the United States, is that we're starting fewer and fewer new businesses. If you look at the startup rate, sort of the rate by which Americans start business, it's down about 10% over the last 15 years. And when you think about where new jobs come from, we like to say that small businesses create jobs, but the truth is it's new businesses that create jobs. Almost all net job growth in America comes from new businesses. So we need people coming in to innovate, to start new businesses, to replace businesses that have closed down. Well, immigrants turn out to be much more likely to start a business. And there's sort of the positive story of like, oh, well, these are risk takers who are coming here. But there's also the reality of if you come here and you don't speak the language, or you have trouble with the language, or you don't have a cousin or an aunt or a brother or a sister who's going to help you get a job, you don't have a lot of other options. And so I think that's the reality, that immigrants tend to come and they are much more likely to start a business. So of the immigrants in America, more than 3 million of them right now own a business. And you think about what that means for American companies. I mean, historically, that's part of the central reason why our American companies succeed the way they do on the global stage. 40% of America's greatest companies are Fortune 500 companies. 40% of them were founded by an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. We also have a healthcare problem. I mean, this couldn't be any more stark than during the pandemic, that we simply don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough home health aides. We don't have enough psychiatrists. 60% of counties in America lack a psychiatrist. Well, it turns out that immigrants they're about 13% of the population. They're 36% of home health aides. They're almost 30% of all doctors. They're more than 30% of all psychiatrists. And that has huge benefits to Americans. They're also, as consumers and taxpayers, because immigrants are paying about $200 billion more into the Medicare trust fund than they're drawing down. And so think about how we're going to keep Medicare afloat. Again, immigration is not the answer that's going to solve all of this, but we are in such a stronger position to meet these demographic challenges and these economic challenges that we have because the world's migrants want to come here. So let me talk about one more demographic trend that makes immigration policy complicated. And this is something that that Tony, I think, was talking about in a really intelligent way and persuasive way on the last column, which is that we're heading towards becoming a majority minority country. And that has really profound impacts on the immigration debate. One of the counterintuitive aspects of how anti-immigrant sentiment shapes up in America is that the places that have the most immigrants are not the ones that are the most intolerant. Quite to the contrary, those tend to be extremely tolerant and welcoming places. The places where anti-immigrant sentiment spikes are in communities that see their first wave of immigration, right? Where you go to the grocery store and for the first time you hear a different language or you see someone who doesn't look like you. And that's scary, right? Because that's a single wave of cultural change. So places like that are places that are totally homogeneous, but next to a diverse place. And what's happening as immigrants are moving to more and more places is that you're seeing more of those spikes, right? The traditional immigrant gateways where people moved into aren't where you're seeing the fastest rise of immigration. You're seeing the biggest rise of immigration in places like Arkansas and Tennessee and states that historically haven't seen a ton of immigration. In the latest census data that just came in, the places that have had the biggest diversity spikes or the increase in diversity were West Virginia and North Dakota. And that's going to create some backlash. And at the same time, you have a world where Americans are increasingly buying into this idea that, as Tony was getting at, that diversity is a strength. And so if you look at polling from Pew and Gallup that poll every year, is immigration a good thing or a bad thing? They've never polled more Americans who think immigration is a good thing. In the Pew poll, it's about 75% of Americans think immigration is a strength for America. Just 10 years ago, it was about just 50-50. People weren't so sure. But the people who don't think that, who are scared by this change, who are starting to see it in their communities for the first time, and they see that this is becoming a majority minority country, there is a lot of racial animus, there's a lot of fear of change, and that is making that an identity not just that they care about, but the issue that they care about that's driving in the polls. And they're becoming more and more, and you're seeing this, a more and more vocal barrier to getting to immigration. And so that's complicating the politics. You see it in primaries all over the place. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, which is as we immigrants move to more places, we know that over time we're going to become a more tolerant country. But in the meantime, there's going to be a backlash, and that backlash is getting stronger and stronger and stronger, even though it's a smaller and smaller minority. So those are the trends that we see, and it leaves me with some reticence, but a lot of optimism, knowing that in the arc of where we're going, we are going towards a more tolerant country. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Great comments. Over to Todd. Todd, good to see you.
Great to be here. I think I'll give a little update on where we are here in Congress, if that's all right. And if I'm like 6 minutes behind on what other people know, please bear with me here. My name is Todd Schultz. I'm with Forward.us. We came into this administration, I think, at like a real turning point question. What was possible, and you've heard from Jeremy, David, about like various aspects of immigration policy. On the power of the executive has substantial power over immigration, over large portions of it. Be that making immigration substantially harder on refugee programs, on certain guest worker provisions. There's a lot the executive can do, but obviously there's a lot of things that have to go through Congress. We have seen for the last 20 years, off and on, big congressional fights and promises about big congressional fights that didn't develop. In 1996, Bill Clinton passed a bill that created essentially the kind of modern undocumented experience in the enforcement environment, the bars that David talked about. They really trap people in this undocumented status. And in the 2 decades since, you've seen various people of both parties promise to do what's called comprehensive immigration reform at various points. And the idea of comprehensive immigration reform, it's both a policy and a political compromise in which you provide some sort of permanent legal status and potentially a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented. You modernize the legal immigration system. There's different ways people have talked about that. And modernize or increase, depending what the provisions are, interior border security provisions there. President Bush campaigned on this, but then punted it to a second term. And in 2006 and 2007, there was an effort, in which time you had 2/3 of the Democratic Party ultimately sign up for it or so, and about 1/3 of the Republican Party. But that wasn't enough to get it done. This is in terms of senators. President Obama promised for comprehensive immigration reform. That was punted out of the first 2 years, but there was a DREAM Act fight which would provide a pathway to citizenship for, I think at the time, about 1 million dreamers. Those are undocumented folks who came to this country either as a visa overstay or crossing the border. That failed, unfortunately. You saw in 2013 a big comprehensive immigration reform push get out of the Senate, but not get to the floor of the House. And then in 2015 and 16, you saw with the rise of Trump and kind of a resurgent explicit xenophobia, a pretty sharp contrast there. Hillary Clinton promised again comprehensive immigration reform. That didn't happen. We all lived through Trump. And then President Biden again ran for saying he would send a comprehensive immigration reform bill, talked about lots of things he would do. So where we found ourselves at the beginning of this year is like, what's possible? We started out on what we called like a 2-track strategy. What can get to 60 in the Senate, and then what we could do through what's called the reconciliation process, and really wanted to be open to both of these. So for a bill to sign into law, it needs a majority of the House. It needs to be signed into law in the Senate, which there's different ways you can do it, and to be signed by the president. We thought from early on that putting forth bills that had previously passed the House that could move quickly was a critical thing for the House to do, rather than get bogged down in a big negotiation, because we did not see a pathway to 60 votes, something that would require at least 10 Republicans and every Democrat, or 20 Republicans, 40 Democrats. We didn't see like a viable pathway to comprehensive immigration reform in this Congress getting to 60 votes in the Senate. So in March, the House, while the president did introduce that bill, the action was on. The House passed what's called the Dream and Promise Act, is the pathway to citizenship for a broad class of dreamers. I know that we were really excited, but David really led this work on including both a broader class of undocumented dreamers, but documented dreamers into that bill. It provided a pathway to citizenship for GPS holders. They also passed the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which would provide legal status and citizenship to existing farm workers with a modernization of the guest worker program for agriculture. None of these bills are perfect. They're far short, both in terms of legal immigration reforms and a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented, but collectively would have been a really critical step forward, and would be a really critical step forward. We worked with a lot of people on this call, and a lot of you as well, to make sure we were building bipartisan support in the Senate. At the same time, we were laying the ground for what's called this reconciliation process. Unfortunately, what we found is that the appetite to get to a bipartisan bill wasn't there. I think, if I'm being very blunt, ironically, this is the furthest that we have found the Republican Party to be away from wanting to get to a pathway to citizenship for even dreamers. That sounds strange to people because Donald Trump is no longer president. And if you remember, Donald Trump basically freaked out on September 5th when he tried to end DACA. He tweeted I love the folks from DACA, go for the Dreamers Congress. That's a paraphrase. I'm thankful I don't have to read the tweets anymore. And there was a way to pressure folks. And because public opinion is clearly on the side here of providing a pathway to citizenship for folks. But as things went there just wasn't the ability to get to 60, and people really leaned into this reconciliation process. What is a reconciliation process? Well, reconciliation means that it is for passing a budget, and things that go into it have to meet what's called the Byrd Rule, named after the former senator from West Virginia, which means they have to basically have a budgetary impact that is substantial, meet a bunch of stuff, and outweigh the policy impact. It's incredibly subjective. I don't think we should run our government this way. I think things should be on a 50-vote margin. People should, if you have 3 levels of government, if you're Republicans or Democrats, you should be able to pass things. Voters should be able to see what parties are for. We should pass things. We may not like all those things from our organization, but we should make it so that Congress has a bias towards action, but we don't have that right now. We have these rules, and they are the best path forward here is to include these in the budget reconciliation process. So we were pleased that as of right now, we've seen Democrats include provisions in the reconciliation bill. Where those are right now, and I'll talk about they're in front of the House bill. So what's in this bill right now? There's a couple things. The first thing is it is currently, they went to the parliamentarian and asked for a pathway to citizenship for a broad number of undocumented immigrants, people who were essential workers, dreamers, and TPS holders to be included. She said no, and she ruled against and said she would not allow people to, she didn't feel that that met the rules, that you could do that to adjust to a green card to a legal permanent resident status. And so now where things are is there is a proposal that has not yet gone back to the parliamentarian, but as it is currently written, would provide work permits and deportation protections. It's a 5-year renewable work permit. It would give people the ability to work legally, to travel and see family, to live without daily fear of deportation. And it would cover people who have been here 10 years or longer. So the average person who would benefit from who's undocumented has been here for 20 years. That would cover all DACA recipients, for example, but it's based on how long people have been in this country. That is currently in the Build Back Better bill that's being debated right now. We think it's critical it remain in that bill. There are other provisions on immigration that we are really excited about. There are what called visa recapture provisions, which would say if green cards have been wasted in previous years, you would go back and get them and we wouldn't waste them going forward. There's also the ability to modernize the green card system by helping to clear backlogs and really substantial improvements that would be for the family-based and the employment-based immigration system. Collectively, as it is right now, while these provisions are far from perfect and everything we need, I want to be clear about that, they would be, if signed into law, clearly the most substantial step forward on immigration policy in a positive way in decades. It's not enough. There's tons of things we need. But it is something that we are really critically focused on trying to get over the finish line here. And I would encourage you all to call your member of Congress today. The reconciliation process is really only an exercise for Democrats. It does not mean we have lost track of our long-term goal that we're going to need to build support in both parties for a broad overhaul of the immigration system. That is where things are right now. This is urgent, not just because the status quo is unacceptable. It is urgent because we desperately need to rebuild the legal immigration system. It's also urgent because we are gonna, I just want to be really clear, probably lose on DACA in the courts really soon. Now, a president has the ability to protect people from deportation and shield them from deportation. But in a 6-3 court, the chances that we will be able to hold on to the ability for deferred action to provide people with work authorization is exceedingly small, and that could happen in the months to come. So this is really such an urgent and critical time. So that's what's going on in Congress. We are optimistic and enthused and fighting hard every minute of every day to answer questions for policymakers. And it's a great time to weigh in with them. So thanks so much for having us.
Todd, thanks for that update. Just a reminder to put your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll be getting to them shortly. Madeline, over to you. I understand you have some slides, so hopefully you'll be able to share.
Yes, so I think this is an occupational hazard of being an economist, that I just love to look at data, and therefore I'm going to inflict on all of you these slides as well. And so hopefully this is going to work. So what I thought might be helpful to add to our discussion today is some more stylized facts about the unauthorized immigrant population. And so Tony's already put a little bit of this in the chat, and Jeremy's mentioned it, and David did as well, but discussing a little bit some of these characteristics. So the first thing is, some of you may know, but some of you may not be aware of, because I don't think the media has emphasized this much, so the unauthorized population is smaller now than it has been for and it's been decreasing over the last decade or so. That population peaked in 2006, 2007, right at the start of the Great Recession. And of course, the housing collapse led to a net inflow of 0 during that period. But since the net inflows have actually been negative, and so the unauthorized population has been falling, despite the fact that until COVID, we had very strong economic growth across most of the United States. Well, even as the population has been falling of unauthorized immigrants, its composition has been changing somewhat. And I think that these changes in composition that I'm about to show you have important implications, not only for the broader economy, but also for policymakers as they think about legalization or bigger changes to immigration policy, as Todd was discussing. One of the changes that we've seen is a smaller share of immigrants from Mexico. So all of these data here are from the Center for Migration Studies in New York, which is just a wonderful source of unbiased data. What is on the left is the pie chart of the distribution of the unauthorized immigrant stock, the number living in this country in 2010. On the right is the pie chart of the same distribution across areas, but for 2019, the most recent year for which we have good data. And what you see most notably is that this dark blue, the share from North America, which is mainly Mexico, not a lot of Canadians here as unauthorized immigrants, has been falling. Well, what's increased in response as a share is from Central America. And I think we know this from the media coverage of people coming from the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador primarily, but also the share from Asia has been increasing. And I think that might surprise people. This is a group we don't typically think of as having unauthorized immigrants, but they do comprise a growing share of our unauthorized immigrant population. Another change over the last decade, as Todd alluded to, is an increase in the length of US residence. That it used to be a decade ago, about half of unauthorized immigrants had been here for less than a decade. These were people with fewer ties to the country, maybe more likely to leave. Whereas now our unauthorized immigrant population, while smaller, is much more firmly established, much more rooted in the US, more likely to have US born children, less likely to leave. And perhaps this increases the imperative for legalizing this population. Another surprising thing about the unauthorized immigrant population is its change in its educational composition. We tend to think of unauthorized immigrants as being very low educated, usually young men from Mexico, but that's increasingly not the case. And indeed, almost 1/5 of unauthorized immigrants have at least a bachelor's degree, while the share who are high school dropouts or not even reach high school has been decreasing over time. So it's a more educated, even more skilled population over time. And again, I find this really surprising. Another thing is that the unauthorized immigrant population is becoming older. So the media is focused very much on the young children at the border with their families. And that's a very compelling media story to share. But actually, children comprise a very small share of the unauthorized immigrant population living in the United States. And children, not just yet very young, but age 15 to 17 are also a small minority. But increasingly, the unauthorized immigrant population is moving into sort of older middle ages and even elderly. So it's an aging population. So what does all of this mean? What I think of as the implications. One thing is that I think there are bigger economic gains here from legalization, particularly to the immigrants themselves. We know from a large number of economic studies that unauthorized immigrants experience large wage gains when they're able to legalize their status. A lot of those gains are due to occupational upgrading, moving into more skilled occupations. And the more educated you are, the more these occupational upgrading can occur. So the bigger those gains from legalization will be to the immigrants themselves. Also, therefore, the fiscal impact is going to be more positive if unauthorized immigrants are able to gain legal status because they'll experience larger wage gains. On the other hand, this increasing diversity and particularly rising education among the unauthorized immigrant population means that they look more like US natives. And that reduces the gains to US natives from having immigrants here. Related to the aging, right now, they're primarily prime age workers. But you can see that as this population continues to age, we're facing lower labor force population ahead as they increasingly enter into retirement ages. So perhaps this bodes somewhat poorly for growth and fiscal impacts. I think the last thing that policymakers need to think very carefully about with legalization is that just legalizing the population here isn't enough, because what we don't want to do is experience what we did in the wake of the 1986 legalization program, where we didn't couple that legalization with an opportunity for people to bring family members in greater numbers. Because it's very likely, given the changes in this population, that they have more family members abroad to bring. In particular, the immigrants coming from Central America and Asia, as opposed to from Mexico, are not traditional immigrant streams. So I think there's going to be large demand as they enter into, if they're able to acquire permanent residence or US citizenship, to bring family members so that their family members can share in the American dream. So I think these are all implications that we might want to think about here as we consider the effects of legalization, and also coupling that with broader changes in immigration policy, as Todd was discussing. So with that, maybe we can discuss some of these proposals and start hitting up the Q&A.
That sounds like a good idea. So why don't we start? This was really great. I learn a lot from hearing you guys each time we do one of these. But why don't we just focus for a second on the art of the possible? Todd started us off there, and I'll give others, kind of an opportunity to talk about where you think this is all going, given the current political reality, and what did we learn on Tuesday that might influence this debate? Others want to focus, take that challenge on? Jeremy, I'll let you start.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Sorry, I was like my mute button. I think Tuesday was sort of a wake up call, right? And I think there's certain people. There certainly has seemed to be a wake up call of we need to actually get things done. That could play out in a couple of different ways for immigration, right? Immigration is a hard issue. Could it mean that it gets thrown by the wayside so people can get other stuff done, or does it mean like we need to have solutions? And one of the things to think about with immigration is the conventional wisdom is you could never do immigration in an election year because it's so hard. People are just thinking about their election. They don't want to touch the third rail of politics. And that's true. And you feel it every election year, except for the fact that it's absolutely never true, which is to say, if you go back for all of the past immigration bills that have had any real impact, the last major immigration bills were passed in 1996, 1990, and 1986. And all of those have in common the fact that they were an election year. And part of the reason for that is not that it's easier in an election year, it's not, it's much harder, but that there's no fiscal cliff for immigration. There's no sort of, if we don't get it done by now, something's going to happen. And so what happens is people just kick it down the road. They'll say what they have to say, but no, they're so afraid of touching it. It's like, we can do this later. And Congress is not in the business of doing things before they have to do them. That is not one of Congress's strong suits, and something it's getting actually particularly worse at. And so what does Tuesday mean? We don't know yet, but it certainly is a forcing issue in that it has made people realize that they have to start moving on passing legislation. And politics moves really, really quickly. You saw it on Afghanistan when the pullout did not go very well, and all of a sudden you saw a huge number of Republican governors and members of Congress just 180 and saying, "Oh my gosh, we owe it to Afghan refugees to resettle them," which I think is fabulous, but was not their position right before that. And so when you think about how politics changes, elections change politics really, really quickly. You're going to see a lot of stuff that's going to happen continually around the border. And so is that going to be something where no one wants to touch immigration because they're afraid of going near the border? Or is it something where all of a sudden people feel like they have to deliver on a solution, in which case they have to come to the table? And so I don't know the answer for that other than to say, this is not a time to let up on the advocacy. This is a time to make sure that if the stars align and there is a window, that we are ready in a real way to march through it. I guess maybe not march to the window, but to take advantage of the moment.
Great. Others who might have comments on where we go from here?
I think on the election thing, I agree with what Jeremy said, that like the conventional wisdom of what you can and can't do is pretty silly, given that like nothing's happened in 25 years. So it's like you've got to do something some way. I think like there's all this big debate about the politics of immigration. I think there's like a fundamental failure in that debate that's premised on two things. The first is this: immigration isn't one thing. It isn't one thing to various people. I think it is entirely accurate to say that like Donald Trump demagoguing on immigration and against immigrants in 2015 was a net positive for him, certainly in the primary and potentially in a general, and that the politics of immigration in his presidency were a net loser for him politically. I think when so much of the debate was around repealing DACA and then family separation, that was like a real political problem for him. And things changed quickly, right? Like in 2018, you had tons of people come out and say, no, we don't want to do these family separation policies. But then you can look at the incredibly hardline policies they pursued later, but they were a little bit out of sight, unfortunately. And the politics around that may have felt different for some people, things that we think are terrible. And so I think like thinking about immigration and the politics of it, it's not one thing, and how you define the frame and where the fight is incredibly important. I think the second thing is this. I think that there's this conversation going on about, particularly in the Democratic, in the Republican Party, this was many years ago, in the Democratic Party, like how to think about being competitive in elections, when the nature of the Senate is stacked against Democrats, the Electoral College recently, things like this. So there's a lot of question about like Latino voters and what are they looking for, and immigration, this and that. I'm like a white guy from Missouri, so I won't pontificate too much on this, but the like central premise that Democrats have made to voters who care about immigration policy, pro-immigrant policy for 20 years has been, we will deliver a pathway to citizenship. They haven't done that. I'm not fully blaming them or saying it is or it isn't, but we've now been through almost 9 years of Democratic presidents in the last 20 years, and that central premise has not been fulfilled. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's really hard to do things, in a case like this, when you're trying to do it on a one-party basis, or people won't give you a floor vote in 2013. But that's like a promise that people have made to voters and they haven't fulfilled on it. And so I think if I were thinking about in 2022 and 2024, how am I going to be competitive in a bunch of states? I would think about fulfilling like a central promise that's important to persuasion universe voters there. So, yeah.
Can I add one thing to that just quickly, because I agree with everything Todd said, and just to keep piling on the Democrats after having hit the Republicans on Afghanistan. I will say that there is a political calculus that seems to have been made in Democratic electoral politics, which is that if you poll voters and you poll Democratic voters, they're all rationally in favor of immigration policy. They think they believe in citizenship, but it is not what drives them to the polls. And if you poll sort of the Republican voters, immigration is a much more salient issue, has been. During Trump, things changed a little bit. And so the lesson that seems to have been learned for Democrats is like, we should talk about what our voters care about. We're going to talk about the economy, jobs, don't talk about immigration. But the fallacy with that logic is like, you don't get to unilaterally decide what issues are talked about. And if you don't talk about immigration and the other side does, they get to define where you're at. And so this idea of sort of avoiding the issue because we're afraid of the elections has a lot more pain than it has gain for them, in the sense of it lets it be framed as if one party's open borders and the other party's not, which is sort of not where this party is. And so instead of being able to make your persuasive case to voters, you're putting your head in the sand. And I think that's one of the things, that has made it harder, that made the electoral politics harder on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, there's the exact opposite, right? People are afraid of their primary voters, and so they don't touch the issue. But it means that then they're always afraid of their primary voters because the issue is always hanging out there, right? That there's a need on both sides. This idea, this sort of pretense that you can somehow avoid this, but it's an issue you can never avoid. It's salient in every election.
David, I want to bring you in this conversation. You've written a lot about legal immigration and the mismatch between the number of workers trying to come in to the U.S. There, the bottlenecks there, and yet, as you pointed out, none of this is being really addressed in any of the legislation. So, give us your perspective on where we ought to be going. How much of this can be addressed through administrative changes? I know you've written quite a bit about that as well. What should we be doing? We talked about not only the legislative part of it, but other avenues for potential reform.
Well, look, first of all, the administration just needs to implement the legal immigration laws that are already on the books. I mean, basically, every single domain of legal immigration is incredibly restricted at this moment. We have a massive backlog of family-based immigrants abroad waiting at consulates that the State Department is failing to process, refusing to process even, basically taking no measures to streamline the processing of those applications. So that's about 500,000 people right there. You look at the refugee program, the President Biden eventually, after a long delay, expanded the refugee cap to 62,000 last year, and then only admitted fewer than 12,000. The green card caps for employment-based applicants. These are people, highly skilled people trying to adjust to permanent residence in the United States. They didn't use all the cap available under that allotment either, wasting about 65,000 green cards for them. And you look at the low skill, we have an H-2B program for seasonal non-agricultural workers in landscaping and other seasonal industries, seafood being one of the primary among them. And Congress actually did pass an immigration law in December of 2020, authorizing them to basically double the annual cap for the H-2B program, another 64,000 visas there. And they only issued 22,000 of them. Intentionally so. That wasn't a processing delay issue. They just said, well, we don't actually see the need for using all 64 plus thousand of these visas, which is, I mean, given the situation with unfilled jobs and the record number of job openings over the summer, that was just an incredibly bizarre decision and determination. And they're now, Congress in September of this year repassed that same provision saying you can still use these visas that you didn't use over the summer. Like, hey, guys, take a hint. We want you to use these. And they still aren't issuing them now that we're in a new fiscal year. So basically, my perspective is that we can do a lot within existing laws just to get back to where we should be under the statutes that Congress has passed. Most consulates around the world that process visas are still at least partially closed. More than 60% were at least partially not processing all of the different types of visas. So, over the last year, we've lost about 1.2 million adult work eligible temporary workers, as well as permanent residents who could be contributing to our economy right now. And if you look at the difference between the number of unfilled jobs before the pandemic, which were around 6 million, and over the summer, we were over 10 million in every month. That's like a quarter of the difference right there. So our economy is suffering from inflation, and businesses are reducing hours and closing even because they can't find workers. And here we have this huge labor force pool that is not being tapped, and it's entirely due to administrative procedures not fulfilling the laws that Congress has already enacted. And that's, and I think the administration could go far beyond where we were before the pandemic under a very restricted system under the Trump administration. So there's a lot that could be done. Right now, our legal immigration system has never been in worse shape in the last 50 years, let's say. I mean, this is a totally dysfunctional, backlogged, inept, inefficient process.
Okay, interesting perspective. Others want to chime in on that, and just add another comment from the chat. We haven't really talked about essential workers very much. And so this idea that essential workers were those who are helping in areas like healthcare or food processing. Let's talk for a second about, what's the art of the possible here? What can we do perhaps to work on with the tools that we have? Other thoughts on that?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think one of the positive things about the pandemic, and I say that with a little bit of hesitation to say anything positive about the pandemic for how horrible it's been, but hopefully one of the lessons we learned from it is that when you think of like the whole concept of essential workers, it was laid so bare who were the workers that kept our economy moving. And it wasn't the PhD STEM grads. We need lots of them too, but it was the people working really, really hard jobs. It was the people keeping our food supply from falling apart. It was the home health aides caring for the sick. It was people cashiers, people cleaning, people transporting goods when the rest of us are quarantining. And when you look at all of those industries, those are heavily immigrant heavy industries, almost every single one of them. And specifically with undocumented workers like that Madeline was talking about, more than half of undocumented immigrants in America work in essential industries. And so you think about, when you think of how do we have a resilient economy? How do we build back from the recession? How do we make sure that we're doing, like, these are workers that are hugely important. They're people who are contributing enormously to our society. And so I think absolutely, when you think there was a chat about in the Q&A about what should the solutions be, having a way to make sure that we are protecting, supporting, and attracting essential workers has to be a part of any immigration reform that we get to. And I think there's never a clearer case about why immigration is such a strength for our society. It's not just economic growth, but it's resilience. And I think that is a way that I think we need to start thinking about immigration reform generally.
Madeline, I know you want to chime in here because you have a paper I know that you're working on at Rice that touches on some of these issues.
Right. I think that the case for providing some special privilege, if you will, to unauthorized immigrants who were essential workers during the pandemic is a very strong moral case, as well as a strong economic case. But I would push back and say that every worker is essential, be they American born or foreign born. We clearly need more workers. And so to cherry pick certain groups based on an unusual point in time and who happen to be in those types of jobs, it's really creating winners and losers in a way we don't need to do, because we just need more workers, and we should recognize the value of everyone's work here. This sounds very uneconomic-y in some ways, but also we don't know what's coming next. And so the next crisis could, the essential workers of that next crisis could be a very different group. And so I think we want to try to create a pathway for everyone who has been here and contributing to the economy and the society, as well as welcoming more people here legally.
I think that's a fabulous point and critique. And one I'll say about, we talk a lot about, we have these gaps in our economy and we have this huge benefit that people around the world want to come here to fill them. And so we could use guest worker programs. We could use our green cards, our permanent work programs, say, hey, we need more STEM grads. We need more of this. But to Madeline's point, immigration has been like the greatest benefit to the United States over our history. And we never had any of those programs. People were just coming. And the reality is, though we can try and make guesses on, you have this skill we need today, in some sense, she's totally right. Like, we should be investing in people and not in positions as well. And so we want to use every tool at our disposal. And if you think about a lot of the people who made the immigrants who built this country and helped made it great, they didn't come here with skills. They didn't come here necessarily learning English. They came here and made a better life and found a way. And so I think you don't want to lose that by trying to just cherry pick certain skills. And so I think we want a system that is dynamic, that balances this idea of, like, we're going to bring in people who want to make a better life with, we need these specific things, and tries to do both.
Yeah, I think the way we think about it is, like, people shouldn't deserve, who are undocumented, a pathway to citizenship because they're an essential worker, but we shouldn't call them an essential worker and then not be willing to give them a pathway to citizenship. Like, we think a much broader class of people, I know we all do, should be able to do that. And look, also to be clear, there's essential workers who are on a work visa where they can't get access to a green card there. But I think to Jeremy's point, something that's so important is, like, we can't accurately predict all of future flows. Like, immigration history is kind of very famously extremely bad at picking like what's going to happen. You can go read about the deal that Ted Kennedy cut to seal the deal in 1965 about what sorts of immigrants were going to come. We should have a dynamic system. We should make it much easier to stay here, and ultimately have an immigration system that isn't just judged on somebody get to come and not be deported, but we should make it so that people can come to the United States for a variety of reasons. It's much easier, it's faster, it's more affordable, be that for family, because they're a refugee. We want the the mom who is going to be willing to risk everything and has no choice to leave behind to come to the United States seeking refuge. And we want the mom who is going to come here to, be with a partner and raise somebody who can be there. And we want the mom who's going to be the computer scientist. We want all these things here. And that's what we should be building.
Good. I want to start sort of integrating a few questions from the Q&A. And there's a question, an interesting question. I want to get your perspective on this. And I'm going to broaden it a little bit. It talks about human trafficking and talks about the asylum process. And we know that a lot of immigrants who cross the border are seeking asylum, yet very few of those asylum applications are ultimately granted. So can you talk a little bit about, how we ought to be thinking about our asylum system, because that seems to be one of the issues that has, been continually putting pressure on this whole immigration debate. Anyone want to take that hot potato?
The asylum system in the United States is basically the one place where an immigrant can apply without, they can show up and they can apply. And that's anywhere, they can cross the border illegally. The law says they should be allowed to apply. Even in those circumstances, of course, that's not actually the reality of what is happening at the border right now, with most of them being expelled back into Mexico. But that is a bad situation from a standpoint of legal immigration and orderly process. I mean, there absolutely needs to be a way to apply for status in the United States from abroad. It's not going to cover everybody. It's not going to, if someone needs to get out of town and get to the border, we should have a process for processing them at a legal port of entry so they don't have to cross illegally. Right now, the ports of entry are closed, so you can't process people there. But there has to be other ways to facilitate both humanitarian and economic immigration to this country. And right now, like I said, we don't have that work visa program that we need in order to facilitate the economic migration. So we end up using asylum as a backdrop for that. And we don't have refugee processing or other forms of humanitarian processing abroad either. So it all ends up falling back on asylum. And when the system that's the only game in town, of course it's going to be overwhelmed. Of course it's going to have far more applicants than are eligible for it. So yeah, we need to drastically rethink what we're doing when it comes to managing migration. We can't keep falling back on everybody crosses illegally and then we figure out, whether their claim is legitimate or not. There has to be a better way to do this. And there is. It's just that no one has had the political will to do it, throughout the history of multiple administrations now.
Can I just jump in? The most important thing that I think if the public does not understand about immigration is exactly what David just said, which is like, there are no legal immigration channels that work for people to come from like large portions of the globe. There is no Western Hemisphere refugee program. As David said, there's no family-based. And so like the heroic, awful, dangerous journey of like someone who has to walk with a child on their back because their husband was killed or targeted and this was the only way they can survive. I don't want to speak for other people. We want to replace that with like a very boring plane ride is what I would say. Like so that people can get on a plane or they can get on a bus and they can come work and they can go back. So they can be with family, they can go back, they can seek refuge. It won't be perfect, but until we have those legal immigration avenues, it all goes to the border and it's compressed and it's awful for the people. Politically, it's incredibly challenging. And like boring working legal immigration is like the most underrated thing that I think we're all advocating for to make that better.
Okay, an important insight. Well, we just have a couple minutes. I want to give each of you one last chance to kind of make a closing statement. And I think we should try to do this. There was a question in the chat about what would you ask people to do? So I think Jeremy mentioned call your representative. So just give us your elevator pitch on what you'd like to see folks who are tuning into this webcast do as a and take away from this discussion.
I guess I'll start. The big takeaway for me is our immigration system is incredibly outdated, and we're dealing with this managing problem in the 2010s and now the 2020s with an immigration system built in 1990, 1986, and even really ultimately the fundamentals of it come from the 1920s. And so that is a fundamentally broken system that we're dealing with. It's incredibly constrained. We let in far fewer legal immigrants than most other developed countries. The Canadian government has a plan to let in 3 times as many permanent residents as the United States admits on a per capita basis, controlling for the size of their country compared to ours. We could be letting in far more people legally than we are right now. And because we're unwilling to do that, we're seeing the consequences in terms of illegal immigration at the border. And so I would just impress upon people that the legal immigration system is neglected in this conversation so often. Not in this one, fortunately. Glad to see such broad agreement among our friends on this important topic, but we need a better legal way for people to come to the United States. Thank you.
Jeremy, last words.
Sure. I mean, I would just say, as you think about how do we fix the system and how do we get over the political impasse, the big thing is just having more advocates. People listen to people they know, right? And so everyone's saying, so what can I do? I'm just one person. I think the more that every single person who is tuning into this is willing to speak up, whether it's writing an op-ed, a letter to the editor, certainly calling your congressman, or just talking to your friends about this, you are giving people the ability to understand and enter this dialogue, right? You can lead with all the data and all the facts in the world, but if people aren't ready to listen, it doesn't matter. And what's going to get them to listen is their community. It's their neighbors, their friends, their relatives. So my encouragement is to talk about this publicly, privately, anywhere you can, and try and help bring some sense to the debate. So thank you.
Okay, over to Todd.
I think, I'll make a pitch. You should call Congress today and tell them to just get something done here, even if you don't like the reconciliation process or whatever it is. I'll make that. I think this is, it's like a real question which way we go. I really mean that here. Like, I think you can envision a couple of years in the future where we make tremendous progress. I think you can envision where basically the windows for real change in Congress really grind down, and the executive branch heads in a really troublesome direction here. So that's my pitch. Is like we're at a real pivot point, and the future is uncertain.
Okay, and Madeline, wrap us up here.
My last relative who was an immigrant came in 1910. There were no immigration policies, no restrictions virtually in place. She just got on a boat and came. And today's story is very different. It's incredibly restricted, as I think we've all made clear. So I think if many of us sit back and think about how our families came and how things have changed, it maybe makes us more willing to welcome immigrants and to understand the desire of everyone to live a better life here in the United States. We're incredibly privileged, and we can welcome a lot more people here to share in that with us.
Okay, that's a very encouraging message to end on. I want to thank all you guys. I learned so much from listening to you every time we have one of these discussions. Very good dialogue. I want to turn this discussion so we'll keep it going. I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague Laura Collins to introduce her panel, and we'll keep the discussion moving. Thank you all, and I look forward to the next discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Brett. And I have the privilege today of introducing and moderating the conversation with this amazing second panel we have about Solutions for the Undocumented. So as Brett said, I'm Laura Collins. I'm a director with the Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute. Today, we're going to talk about solutions for the undocumented. As we know, this is a hot political topic, but it is one where we really do need actual practical solutions. We need to have policies based on facts and not on myths. And so we have a really nice lineup for you today. I will introduce them briefly, and then I will ask them each to do a presentation. Please use the Q&A function if you would like to ask a question. I find your questions so much more interesting and insightful than my own questions typically. And so we really do want to have the opportunity to answer those questions that you have. So let's get started. Our panel today, Jose Ivan Rodriguez-Sanchez is a research scholar for the Center for United States and Mexico at the Baker Institute. Lawrence Benenson is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for the National Immigration Forum. Julia Gillette is a Senior Policy Analyst for the Migration Policy Institute. And Teresa Cardinal Brown is a Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you all so much for joining us. So I'm going to start with, and I don't see your camera on, but I'm going to start with you, Yvonne. You've done some really interesting work on economics of the undocumented. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what we know about this population in terms of the economics?
I'm having a little bit of problems with my camera. Just a second, I'm trying to fix that. Sorry for that. And hopefully I can, if not, I will start. Finally, sorry for that. Good morning, and thank you very much for having me today. The goal of my presentation is to provide some economic evidence on the importance of immigration for the US and Texas economies. We know that documented and undocumented immigrants support not only these economies, but also other economies in the US and even the Mexican economy. In the case of undocumented immigrants, they come to the US to work and have a better quality of life, as it was just pointed out in the other panel. The reasons are to escape violence, natural disasters, and poverty of their home countries. But why the US? Well, the answer is simple. American firms need workers, and undocumented immigrants need jobs. So they will continue to come to the US until its labor market clears. However, some people forget that, and they also argue that undocumented immigrants only generate costs to the local, state, and federal governments, since they must provide them public services. But these people forget that undocumented immigrants also generate benefits, since they have to pay taxes such as sales taxes, income taxes, and other fees. Some papers have estimated those costs and benefits and the net benefit of having undocumented immigrants in different states of the US, most with a positive result. The Center for the United States and Mexico published a paper analyzing this issue for Texas last year. The title was Undocumented Immigrants in Texas, a cost-benefit assessment. I basically replicated and updated with some minor changes the report published by the Texas State Comptroller in 2006, where this study found that undocumented immigrants generated more in state revenue than the cost they exacted in services. So I follow its methodology and estimated the total cost of providing public service to undocumented immigrants in three major areas: education, healthcare, and incarceration. The total cost to the state of Texas was around $2 billion in 2018. What about the benefits? Well, undocumented immigrants have to pay sales taxes, as I just said, utility taxes, property taxes, and other fees. In this case, the total benefit obtained from undocumented immigrants for Texas was approximately $2.42 billion in 2018. Therefore, if we compare benefits and costs, I found a net benefit of around $420 million in 2018. What does it mean? Well, it means that for every dollar spent on public services for undocumented immigrants, they provide $1.21 in fiscal revenue for the state of Texas. So basically, they are paying more for the public services they are receiving. In this paper, I also conducted an economic impact analysis of what the cost for the state of Texas would be if all undocumented workers were deported. I use Implant to estimate this scenario. Implant is an economic software that accurately replicates the economies of the US and its counties and states. So this scenario would create a loss of around $171 billion in the gross domestic product of Texas, around 10% of its GDP. So this is a major negative impact on the Texas economy. This reinforces the importance of this group as a key driver of the Texas economy. Now, for the second paper, well, the title was Left on the Table, the Unrealized Economic Potential of the Undocumented Population. And basically, this paper hypothesizes that the legalization, temporary or permanent, of undocumented immigrants and their inclusion in the banking system, the healthcare system, and the housing market would produce a positive ripple effect in the US economy, leading to a win-win outcome for both the unauthorized population and the United States as a whole. Therefore, my central question of this paper was, will the US economy benefit from the inclusion of more undocumented immigrants in the banking, healthcare, and housing sectors? Many undocumented immigrants prefer not to access these sectors due to their immigration status and the uncertainty of being deported at any time. Hence, if we compare the immigrants, the proportion of immigrants in these three sectors with that of legal groups in the US, we find huge differences. If more of undocumented immigrants could access these sectors, the expected outcome in the US economy should be positive. As an example, if an undocumented immigrant decides to access the banking system and make a deposit of $100 in his account, the bank can multiply that money, since the bank will provide it to other households to invest or buy goods and services or consume. And with that, we are going to have more investment, more consumption, more savings, and with that, of course, an increase in GDP. At the end, the result would be a greater economic growth in the US. So the same result would be for undocumented immigrants entering the healthcare and housing sectors. I use again Implant to estimate the economic impact of including more undocumented immigrants in these three sectors, and different scenarios can be found in the paper. I will only discuss the one in which undocumented immigrants will enter these three sectors simultaneously and behave either like foreign-born citizens or foreign-born non-citizens. Assuming that this can be possible in 1 year, I can estimate the impact of these two scenarios on the US economy. For these cases, we will assume that more undocumented immigrant households will improve their banking levels, insurance levels, and home ownership rates to be the same as legalized households in the US. For all these cases, I obtain positive economic impact from the inclusion of undocumented immigrants in these sectors. For example, in the first case, if undocumented immigrants had access to these three markets and behaved as foreign-born non-citizens, output would increase around $98 billion, around 0.46% of US GDP, as well as taxes will increase around $9.8 billion. In the second case, if they earn citizenship and gain access to these three markets simultaneously, the gains in output will be around $246 billion, around 1.15% of US GDP. And the tax revenue collected by all governments from undocumented immigrants would total $26 billion, approximately 0.77% of total government revenue. So we have huge positive impacts if this group can access these sectors. Therefore, to conclude, we must first understand the importance of these immigrants to the US economy and Texas, and given this evidence, provide them with a path of legalization, as the potential gains, as we see, are positive and significant. And you can see other papers in other states, as California, Arizona, and also for the US. So the win-win situation is a fact. We will have economic growth, and undocumented immigrants would be better off. So we have to take advantage of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's really compelling data. Julia, this conversation, given that data, it seems like legalization would be something that would be more viable. But we often in legislation hear of legalization as, sort of these big programs set up, right? You think of a DREAM Act or a Dream and Promise Act, or even some of the components of the past comprehensive reform movements. But there are other legal tools we can use. Can you tell us about some of the other ways that a legalization could be achieved that isn't necessarily through the ways we think about in a typical political setting?
Sure. Thanks, Laura, and thanks to the Baker Institute for including me in this conversation. As Yvonne mentioned, we have 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States today. Most of them have no way to get in line for a green card, to get right with the law, really have very limited options. Some may be able to leave the United States for 10 years and be away from their family and then come back with legal status. But for most of them, there really is no on-road to legal status. So today I'm going to review some of the options, as Laura mentioned, for offering legal status to unauthorized immigrants that Congress could consider or that any presidential administration could consider. And the first one is that broad legalization. So that is what people usually think about, is some kind of policy that would offer green cards or a path to citizenship, maybe a long one, to most or all of the 11 million unauthorized immigrants. This is what the US did in 1986 with the Immigration Reform and Control Act. It was a broad legalization. People had to have been in the US for 4 years. They paid a small filing fee. They had to show a clean criminal record. And then they could get temporary status if they showed English and civics knowledge or school enrollment, they could get a green card. So that is one option, but it is a politically really challenging option to have such a broad legalization proposal, although Congress has debated this as part of comprehensive immigration reform, but of course those laws haven't passed. What might be more feasible is a more targeted legalization, and there are various groups among the unauthorized immigrant population that have been considered over time for something more targeted. Dreamers, as Laura mentioned, is one. We've seen the DREAM Act introduced since 2001 to help unauthorized immigrants who entered the United States as children. But we've also seen other groups start to appear as in proposals for legalizing more targeted groups. So one of those is farm workers, recognizing that we rely on a lot of unauthorized immigrant farm workers to put food on all of our tables. The US has at various times considered legalization specifically for farm workers. And this was actually part of IRCA in 1986 as well. There was a broader legalization for farm workers than for other unauthorized immigrants. The House has passed a bill that would include a legalization for farm workers, both in 2019 and again this year. We've also seen some other groups being considered more recently. One is people who have temporary protected status, or TPS. So this is a status that the Secretary of DHS can offer to nationals of a country that has experienced a natural disaster or armed conflict or some other extraordinary and temporary event. Those who have TPS were, saw their protection. So they have protection from deportation, they have work authorization. Under the Trump administration, there was a threat that many of them would lose their status as the administration tried to end their TPS protections, but that was blocked by the court. But that raised attention to this group, and they have been included in some bills that have passed the House, the Dream and Promise Act, that would have offered legalization both to Dreamers and TPS holders. And then I know the previous panel mentioned essential workers. This is another group that's much more recently being considered for legalization because of their contributions during the pandemic, the important work that these essential workers did. And we've seen European countries as well offer specific paths to legal status and permanent residence for essential workers. This is something that Congress has at least considered. And in the debates, Democrats in Congress have tried or are trying right now to offer legalization through something called reconciliation, a purely partisan effort. And their plan A really was legalization for these groups: Dreamers, TPS holders, and essential workers, which would have included farm workers. There are some other maybe more creative ways of going about legalization that Congress could consider, looking at some older provisions of immigration law and re-upping them to help segments of the unauthorized immigrant population. So one of these is moving up the registry date. And we actually saw this being considered in reconciliation as well. So in 1929, Congress created something called the registry. At the time, it said that if immigrants had been in the United States since 1921 and they could show good moral character, they could apply for lawful permanent residence. And this was almost like a statute of limitation. So at the time, it was European immigrants who had either come without permission under, newly created immigration laws, or maybe they had come in some kind of temporary status and fallen out of status. And this gave them a way to get back on a path to a green card. Over time, Congress moved the registry date, but the last time it moved it was in 1986, and it left it at that time at 1972. So unauthorized immigrants who have been in the United States since 1972 and have good moral character can get a green card, but those who have entered after don't have any path to do so. So one of the proposals in reconciliation was to move that date up to January 1st, 2011. And we at MPI estimated that about 7.1 million unauthorized immigrants would be able to get green cards through such a measure. This is, in a way, an easy fix. All it requires of Congress is changing one date in law. It doesn't require a complicated bill. Nevertheless, the politics around this remain challenging. Another old immigration law provision that could be revived is something that used to be called suspension of deportation and more recently called cancellation of removal. This is something that was created in 1940. And the way that this worked before 1996 was that if unauthorized immigrants had been in the US for at least 7 years and they showed good moral character, and they showed that their deportation would cause extreme hardship to themselves or to a US citizen or green card holding spouse, child, or parent, they could have their deportation canceled and they could get a green card. But immigration law changes in 1996 made this pathway much, much narrower. It increased the period of residence to 10 years and raised the standard of hardship to exceptional and extremely unusual hardship to a US citizen or LPR holding close family member. And the number of grants was capped at 4,000 per year. So what had been a, not very broad, but available pathway to legal status for longer term resident unauthorized immigrants became a very, very narrow pathway. Congress could restore the program to its pre-1996 state or change it in other ways. This could be a way to offer legalization to unauthorized immigrants with deeper ties to the United States, with family ties in the United States. So those are some of the options that Congress could consider. There are also options that a president could consider absent congressional action. And presidents can't just hand out green cards to unauthorized immigrants, but they can offer relief from deportation and work authorization. And of course, we've seen this through the creation of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which provides exactly that for unauthorized immigrants who entered as children and entered before 2007. Another pathway that presidential administrations have is temporary protected status, which we talked about. President Biden has actually already greatly expanded the number of people covered by temporary protected status. So when he took office, about 319,000 people had TPS. He opened TPS for Venezuelans and expanded the number of people from Haiti, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia, but primarily Haiti, who would qualify for TPS. And according to estimates from the government, this will make about another 427,000 people eligible for TPS. So that is something that is under executive authority. Of course, it's supposed to be a temporary program, but we really haven't seen it be very temporary in many cases. Many countries have had TPS for decades at this point. Deferred enforced departure is something else the executive branch controls. It's very much like TPS, but the president, rather than the secretary of DHS, grants it. This was available for Liberians, and President Trump granted it to Venezuelans right before leaving office, but now they also have TPS, so that's a bit moot. A president could also try to offer something like DACA to other groups. We saw President Obama try this with DAPA in 2014, but that was for parents of US citizens and green card holders. That was very quickly blocked by the court. So other attempts like this would be likely to face litigation, and we're seeing litigation over DACA as well. And that brings us to the most controversial, perhaps, proposal, which is something called parole in place. So the Secretary of DHS has the authority to parole someone, bring someone into the United States without a visa if there's a humanitarian reason or other significant public benefit. This is how Afghans are being brought into the United States, is as parolees. Arguably, the government can also parole people who are already in the United States but don't have legal status. And since 2013, US Citizenship and Immigration Services has actually been giving parole to family members of members of the military, veterans, and military recruits. Parole doesn't give people a direct path to a green card, but it does give them protection from deportation and work authorization. And for people who entered the country illegally, it actually can make it easier for them to legalize through family sponsorship in certain cases. So there have been discussions of a president using parole for a much larger group than just family members of the military. However, this is also very likely to face litigation. Parole is supposed to be used on a case-by-case basis, not be granted to whole groups. And this could happen through individual applications, arguably, but very likely there would be litigation around this point. So there are more options on the table that we'll hear about, and the politics around all of these are really difficult, but that's just a beginning of the menu of options for legalization.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. Larry, I know that National Immigration Forum has also explored what some of these options are. So why don't you give us a little bit of a preview of some of the things that you've been working on and ways that NIF is thinking about this issue?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. And thanks to the Baker Institute for having me. I'd like to build off Julia's great menu of options there and focus on two additional options that we think could be relatively simple fixes to the immigration system that would help ease the dysfunction and provide some solutions for undocumented people. And the first is ending the so-called 3 and 10-year bars, and the second is reviving something called INA Section 245I. So to start with the 3 and 10-year bars, what are the 3 and 10-year bars? So in 1996, Congress created the 3 and 10-year bars under a larger enforcement bill called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. Many of us know that as IRA informally. Essentially what they say is if you're residing in the country, in the United States, without authorization for long periods of time, there will be a subsequent immigration consequence if you leave and attempt to come back. So if you're in the US for 6 months or more consecutively without authorization, you leave the US and you want to come back, you are barred from re-entering for 3 years. Same thing, if you're in the US for 1 year or more and you leave and you try to come back, a 10-year bar. The intention here, of course, was deterrence. It was to send a message to tell the undocumented population, don't spend extended periods of time in the US without authorization, or else there's going to be a consequence if you want to come back. And the thought was this would disincentivize people from overstays, from remaining without authorization for extended periods, and also deter future unlawful immigration. Say somebody who wanted to come to the US to work for a couple of years and then leave. The intent was to channel them into legal immigration options. The result has been somewhat surprisingly the reverse. The 3 and 10-year bars, by most accounts, do not seem to have worked and probably have actually had the effect of increasing the undocumented population. And that's reflected across a number of measures. So since 1995, the undocumented population has largely doubled from about 5.5 million to 11 million. That, of course, is not entirely due to the 3 and 10-year bar. The number of factors have gone into that, but the overall undocumented population has doubled. Now, if you look at a couple other metrics, like the average length of stay, that has gone up significantly since the passage of IRA in 96. In 95, the median length of somebody who is unauthorized, the median length of stay was about 7 years. Now, going up to 2017, more than doubled to 15 years. And similarly, if you look at the breakdown of the population and how long people are staying for longer periods of time. In 95, before the passage of the 3 and 10-year bars, about a third of the undocumented population was in the United States for 5 years or less, approximately, give or take a few points, a third between 5 and 10 years, and about a third more than 10 years. By 2017, 2/3 of the population are long-term residents of more than 10 years. So we've seen a shift forward of people staying longer. And I would argue, and I think many people have seen that the 3 and 10-year bars create incentives that actually drive this practice, that drive the fact that people are staying longer. And here's how this works. Prior to 96, before you had these bars in place, it was very common for somebody to come to the US, take on seasonal work, say come to the US, spend 7 months, 8 months working, travel back home for a period of time, and then come back to the United States subsequently in another year. And even beyond the seasonal context, it was common for somebody to say, leave a family in Mexico, come to the US to work for 2 years, send money home, and then return and go back. And then subsequently, a few years later, come back to the US to work. The 3 and 10 year bars entirely disincentivize that practice. What they say is, if you have these lengthy terms of unauthorized stay in the US, you're going to be barred 3 years, or in many cases, 10 years. So what people have done reacting to those incentives is they've come to the US and they've stayed rather than working 2 years and going back to Mexico and then coming to the US subsequently. They've just stayed in the US and in many cases brought their families. So it actually has had the unintended consequence of increasing the unauthorized population in the US. Also has had some really bad consequences for impacted families, particularly mixed status families, of say an undocumented parent and US citizen kids. That family travels, say they don't realize they're barred, they go on a vacation out of the United States and they attempt to come back. The parent could very easily find themselves barred from reentering for 10 years. And in the context of adjustment, because in many instances, people who are attempting to adjust to LPR status are required to travel to their home country and apply to US consulate abroad. The 3 and 10 year bar really disincentivizes that from occurring. If say somebody is is eligible for a green card through marriage, but they have to fly to their home country and apply to the consulate, even though they're otherwise eligible to get lawful permanent resident status, they'll know that they'll be barred if they come back to the United States with very few exceptions. So in many cases, people aren't applying. So this is a portion of the undocumented population that could very easily adjust, would be otherwise eligible, and they don't even apply to adjust because they know that they're going to face these bars. Very simple fix to this. Congress can end the bars. They haven't worked, and they've seemingly driven up the undocumented population. Alternatively, if the political lift on that is too hard, bars can be less punitive. Canada has somewhat different, but they have some immigration bars, but there the penalties are for the most part just 1 year. Other countries like Australia have a 3-year bar, but don't have that 10-year bar. So you can adjust these penalties. And additionally, Congress could create additional exceptions and waivers, particularly for people who are seeking to adjust status and would otherwise be eligible to get their green card. So that's one fix that is relatively simple. The other, which is even more simple, and this is somewhat similar in some ways to the registry option that Julia described, is Section 245I of the INA. And this is a provision of the Immigration Code. It's on the books that says certain people who are physically present in the United States, even if they're undocumented, can apply for lawful permanent resident status if they have an employment-based or family-based immigration petition that was filed by a certain deadline. Under 245I, qualified applicants can waive their immigration violations, simply pay $1,000 fee, essentially a fine, and they get right with the law. They're able to adjust. And again, this is not the entire undocumented population. These are people with employment-based petitions, family-based petitions, people who are coming here to work and get a green card, who are eligible through marriage to get a green card, and a very easy fix, which is currently in our immigration code. Now, why isn't this used very often now? Because it's essentially dead letter. It was enacted in 1994 originally, had a deadline of 1997 as the time your petition needed to be filed. It was extended by Congress most recently in 2000, but the current deadline where you need to have a petition on file for an employment-based or family-based immigration filing was April 30th, 2001. So once that deadline was hit, people could still take advantage of 245I. In 2002, 2003, throughout the 2000s, thousands of people were able to use this to adjust status. And these are people, again, who are eligible for green cards and for getting out of undocumented status. So it was a very positive provision. But here, 20 years out, pretty much everybody who would have had those petitions on file has already filed. They've already used 245I, or they've already adjusted another way. So again, this is simply a case where Congress can shift a deadline. They can set the deadline to April 30th, 2021, or even 2031, or even get rid of the deadline. It's a one-line bill. It's an easy fix. Lets people who otherwise are eligible get right with the law. It would be a very sort of simple solution that would allow people to, the undocumented population, to get right with the law.
Great. Thank you so much. Some more good ideas, obviously. But, Teresa, when I hear these good ideas, as you know, in policy world, these good ideas sometimes run up against the reality, not just of passing Congress, but of implementation. So can you give us some idea a little bit about the practicality of some of the solutions proposed here today and what of them might be more workable versus less as we think through what are some practical solutions?
Well, thank you very much, Laura, and thank you to the Baker Institute for inviting me. I think this is a part of the conversation that doesn't get talked about a lot because the hard work of trying to get something past Congress takes up all of the energy. And then even if we succeed, sort of the implementation falls off the end of the train. And we've seen that good policy or even bad policy can get further bollocksed up when we have bad implementation. And it's true, not just in immigration, it's true in a lot of things. Think about the terrible rollout of the healthcare marketplaces for the ACA, or frankly, President Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, which tended to be very chaotic. Or even President Trump, who tried to implement his travel ban over a weekend with absolutely no forethought of what to tell the people on the ground to actually do with that. And it was a couple of weeks of mass chaos. So I think it's really imperative that as we're thinking of different types of proposals that might be beneficial in helping the unauthorized population become legal, we have to consider what it's going to take to actually make that real. And I think we have to reflect back on what we heard from the last panel, particularly from David Beer, that we have seen a 60% decline in legal visas issued over the last year because of the contraction of our immigration system, both as a legacy of the Trump years, but also just due to COVID. The fact that consulates overseas are not reopened yet. We have some of the largest processing backlogs at USCIS in generations. Green cards, employment authorization documents, temporary visas, and that's not even counting the backlogs due to immigration caps. This is people who should be able to get their visa right now that are waiting months and sometimes years for that outcome. Our system is just overburdened. And, we've seen, for example, we've had to redirect resources from processing of affirmative asylum cases by USCIS to processing the humanitarian pool for the Afghan refugees. And now that's even slowing down, right? We know the backlogs in the immigration courts. So, we've seen, as Congress is considering in reconciliation different means of providing some sort of status to the undocumented, there's a recognition that USCIS is going to need money. There's some $200 million appropriated to USCIS just to do this processing, but it also requires they stand up this entire, whatever is passed, within 6 months on an overburdened system. And I think it's important for us to be realistic about what's doable. What might have been doable even 5 years ago or 10 years ago may not be doable with the system we have now. And so I think that's really, really important to think of it. We are right now in a position where our immigration system is lurching from crisis to crisis. We are moving resources across the system, but we have not significantly expanded the capacity of our system in a very long time, whether that is immigration courts or asylum officers or our legal immigration system. And so I think we need to invest in the capacity of our system to do its regular job and whatever we might do on a bigger scale. It's not really sexy to focus on implementation. It is like the least sexy thing, but it is really important because it's no good to promise a benefit to people that you can't deliver. And I feel very strongly about this. I do not want to promise anything, even if it passes Congress, if we can't actually deliver it. So I think that there are a couple of things that we need to bear in mind. Some of these that are legislatively relatively easy, and I don't mean that politically, I mean as both Larry and Julia said, just changing a single line in the Immigration and Nationality Act could still result in, as Julia said, 7 million new applications into an already overburdened immigration system, right? How long is it going to take to process those applications? Are there any protections for people while they have their applications in process, or do they have to wait until they're decided? What happens to those who don't get it, right? What does that go then into the enforcement system? These operational considerations really need to be included in part of the thinking in the legislative process. Unfortunately, we've seen less and less of that in the last several years. When I worked at Department of Homeland Security in 2006 and 2007 and 2008, when Congress was last considering comprehensive immigration reform under George W. Bush's presidency, I was part of a team of 20 people from Department of Homeland Security whose job it was to help Congress understand all the operational implications of what they were proposing. Our job was to tell them, okay, if you want to do it this way, here's what we're going to need to make that real and do it right. And I don't know whether that's happening right now. I don't know how involved people at Homeland Security with that operational experience are helping Congress, or if Congress is even willing to pay attention to it at this point. But I think it's really important. As far as the different types of legal status that might be granted, I will say that a program that is not brand new, something that is already in statute, that already has regulations, is much easier for the government to implement. So something like 245I or even parole that has a set of standards around it that doesn't require the government to create a whole new set of regulations, which is also a very complex and time-consuming process, is easier to implement on a shorter-term basis. The policy guidance can be tweaked from what exists now. Certainly, any prospect that is just taking people from an unauthorized status to some sort of way to go through the existing legal process is much easier because, again, the requirements to do that are already in regulation and statute. The policy prescriptions are generally out there and can be tweaked as necessary. So I think from an operational perspective, that is something to consider when we're thinking about what are the options to legalize people. The broadest possible legalization, I mean, IRCA took many, many months of regulations and frankly resulted in decades of litigation over those regulations and who was left in and who was left out, and at least 2 separate subsequent legislative fixes to people who were left out due to regulatory decisions. So again, if you want to promise something to people that you can actually deliver, thinking about those operational considerations can be very, very helpful. The other thing I think it's worth reminding people is that when we're talking about what to do about the undocumented population already here, and I was glad to hear the previous panel talk about legal immigration alternatives. Legalizing people already here is remediation of the system, right? It's addressing the failures of the past. It is helping people who already are here, but it does nothing to reform the system going forward. And I think that conundrum, and that's one of the reasons it's oversimplified in the political sphere, a trade-off of amnesty for border enforcement. What we're really saying is, okay, even if we were to legalize everybody here right now, what happens to the next person who shows up at the border or overstays a visa? And how do we revise and reform our system so we're not dealing with another several million people in another decade and have to keep doing this? Because the fact that we have so many undocumented people really is a product of a broken immigration system, a broken legal system. And it's absolutely true that migrants would much prefer to come legally. How do we know this? Because tens of thousands of them put their name on a list at ports of entry to try to get into the country and waited there for months in squalid camps rather than going between the ports of entry where they could get in immediately because they just wanted to try to do it the right way. They had every incentive not to. And there were some that did the opposite. But let me tell you that if we expand our legal immigration avenues and the capacity of our system to process it, we would have a lot smaller problem at the border. And, I worked for Homeland Security secretaries under President Bush and President Obama, both of whom said, if you want me to secure the border, give me more legal visas. So the one thing that I would actually add to this is that expanding legal immigration, not only with some of these pathways that Larry and Julia talked about, could actually help a lot of the undocumented in the United States, but more so would help us deal with a potential future undocumented migration. And I think that is also a very operational thing to think about, because otherwise we're just putting a lot of money into enforcing a system that, as Yvonne said, is somewhat unenforceable. We are acting as if we don't have a need for these people when it's very clear that our economy does and can benefit from them. And yet we have an overly restrictive legal immigration system. It's like the federal government trying to enforce prohibition. After a while, they just gave up. And I'm not saying we should do that, but we do need to think realistically about what we're dealing with here. To have an unrealistically restrictive legal immigration system requires so much investment in enforcement mechanisms that are not working. And so I think that type of rethink is also necessary. So I'll stop with that and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And you're right. When laws don't work, we have an obligation to change them so that this is a system that does work and that benefits us even more than what immigration would benefit us otherwise. Reminder to those watching, please drop your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start our round of questioning, though, going back to Yvonne about his economic papers, because it's compelling data. So often this political conversation doesn't really talk about those benefits that we get from the undocumented, particularly when we're talking about legalization. Very few people focus on those benefits because what we hear so often, especially on things like, permanent legislative solution for dreamers is, we talk about this population size as if we really need to make it small, when obviously the benefits of legalization are there. And the more people you legalize, the more benefits you're going to realize. And the cost conversation here is always so, I think I would say untethered from reality, right? There are real costs to having an undocumented population, but the cost of enforcing the law against them are so much greater. What do we need to do, in your opinion? How do we get that message across better and make sure more people understand that economics and that cost benefit analysis in a realistic way instead of a perceived way?
Well, we need to keep writing these type of papers and link them to stories of success of these people in the US. It should be noted that these benefits to the economies of the United States and Texas and the success of undocumented immigrants in education, for example, or business, are despite the many negative factors that these people face. For example, poor working conditions, low wages, discrimination. But despite that, they achieve their goals, they help their communities, and of course, they love this country. They want to stay here, and they, as we said, they want to be legalized in order to access what they need to access, such as education, healthcare, to have a house. So events like this help spread the word about these positive outcomes and the importance of undocumented immigrants in the US. I hope this will make politicians aware of these results and add them to the debate to have a comprehensive immigration reform. And also to understand that this is not only about economics. I'm an economist, and of course the results are there, but also for humanitarian reasons. We have people that, because they don't have access to healthcare, they have to wait until they are very sick, and the probability of survive is pretty low. So we have also, for humanitarian reasons, to understand this issue.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to one of the questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to give it to Julia because you did talk about DACA and DAPA, but anyone else is free to weigh in here because it touches a little bit on this viability issue and implementation. The question is, if the president can do a program like DACA, why is it expected that the Supreme Court might strike it down?
Right. So DACA has faced various legal challenges, and not initially. Initially, the program was kind of accepted, but then it did face litigation, and there are really two legal questions. So one is, did President Obama create the program in the right way? Did he go through the right procedures in creating the DACA program? And this is where a Texas judge has said that no, the administration didn't follow the right procedures under the Administrative Procedures Act. And so the Biden administration has proposed a rule that basically recreates DACA, but goes through the regulatory process with notice and comment to try to fix that issue. The other question is, does the president really have this authority to basically give people protection from deportation and work authorization? And what the Obama administration said is, presidents clearly have the right to use discretion in how they enforce immigration law. No president has arrested and deported all of the unauthorized immigrants in the United States. They're always using discretion to target those who are a priority, maybe because of their criminal record, maybe because they recently violated an immigration law. So this is just an extension of that authority to say, we're using our discretion to say that we are not going to enforce immigration law against this group of people who entered the United States as children. And in recognition of that, we'll give them deferred action and we'll give them work authorization. But this is arguably an open legal question, whether this exceeds presidential authority to have this group that's given protection. So I did say that presidents have this power, but that is an open question of exactly how much power do presidents have. When deferred action was used on a case-by-case basis, it existed before DACA. When it was used on a case-by-case basis, it was accepted. But DACA was the broadest use of that kind of status, so that situation that presidents have used, and it is facing legal challenges, and the future of DACA is a bit uncertain at this point.
Laura, if I could just jump in and add here, I think we're in a very different political environment, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years when it comes to executive power. I think Todd said that the Immigration Nationality Act gives the president broad executive authority, and it does. But we are now in a political position in this country where opponents of a president's immigration policy will use litigation in an effort to forestall that policy. And we saw it with the litigation against DACA and DAPA under the Obama administration. We saw it in spades during the Trump administration when immigration advocates sued him over just about every policy he put on the table. And now the Biden administration has faced lawsuits over his 100-day moratorium, his initial immigration enforcement memo, over metering, which was actually a Trump policy, and Title 42, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's hard right now to say categorically what the authority of a president is, because we really don't know how the courts are going to come down on this. The Supreme Court kept DACA in place when Trump tried to kill it because they said he didn't do it properly. That same argument was made by the Texas judge to say, well, Obama didn't do it properly, we put it in place. So, the judiciary rulings have the potential to not just favor people in favor of immigration and immigrants. I mean, it can be used either way. And I think more importantly, we are asking our courts to make immigration policy for us because Congress isn't acting. And I think that is an absolute misplacement of the responsibility on immigration. Congress has the responsibility to set immigration policy for the president, for the country. The president has the responsibility to implement that legislation as best they can. And the courts should be used, as they have been historically in immigration, mainly to decide very fine questions of interpretation of the law in particular cases. Is this type of criminal action grounds for deportation? Most of our federal judicial rulings on immigration are that kind of a ruling. very few have been this kind of sweeping policy. We don't like what the president is doing. You killed MPP. We think you should be doing MPP. We're going to sue you. So I just think we're in a very different place politically and legally than we have been in any time in the last 20 years when it comes to broad uses of executive authority. And I think we need to focus as much as we can on putting that responsibility back where it belongs, on Congress, because otherwise we're promising things that we can't be sure will stay.
Yeah, I think you're right about the court issue, and that, these really aren't fights about immigration policy, right? Immigration policy has been a proxy for the branches fighting about executive power and these bigger constitutional questions. But our immigration policies suffer because of it, because Congress has been unable to really make that lasting sort of bipartisan change that I think we all want to see, which is unfortunate. Obviously, there's always going to be these fights about executive power versus legislative power. I wish it was a different policy topic that was the proxy for it, especially because so many people, real lives are impacted by the way these fights play out. And they're not really fights about whether Dreamers should have legalization or a work permit, right? They're really just fights about who wields the power in Washington. Larry, your talk was about, these incentives that the 3 and 10-year bars have created unintentionally. And Teresa talked about how we have to balance good policy ideas with practicality of implementation. But a lot of what we also talk about is, how do you balance deterrence with these other pieces? And I know that there are some who really do like the 3 and 10-year bars politically because they think it looks like strong enforcement. Obviously, you've shown that those incentives weren't really what they were intended to be. How do we take something like that and really try to balance that good, smart deterrence and enforcement with a policy that's not going to incentivize behaviors we don't want to see?
Yeah, I think that's the right question to ask. And I think, looking at, some of these enforcement policies that are in place, the question is whether they actually are working. In the case of the 3 and 10-year bar, the data we have over the last 25 years seems to suggest they're not working, that rather than deterring people, they're more often than not creating incentives that drive up the undocumented population. And this is true along a number of different enforcement policies. The Title 42 border policy, which is purportedly a CDC health policy, but has been used starting in the Trump administration, but continuing through the Biden administration as an effort to limit the ability of people to enter the United States. Seems in some ways to perhaps be driving up the border numbers each month of unlawful crossings because we have recidivism. There isn't a real consequence attached to somebody being turned back under Title 42. So people might try 2, 3, 4, 5 times and even more to cross. So in terms of delivering a consequence and actually working to deter people, the question is certainly mixed, and looking to the data, looking to actual results is really important as we formulate policies. I think there's a lot of room for Congress to be more creative in terms of immigration enforcement policies, even if they want to, take a deterrence mode. And there are questions, how well deterrence works at all. But they can do things other than barring people and other than, taking the most draconian, penalties. There's some room for, fining people. You could set, for instance, of the 3 and 10-year bar example, rather than put a bar on somebody who overstays, you can assess a fine. You can create a delay in immigration processing. If somebody has a 6-month overstay, but they're otherwise going to be eligible to adjust status, put a time delay on their adjustment if you want to deliver a consequence. You don't need to bar them out of the United States for 10 years. And in lots of cases, the 10-year bar is just totally disproportionate to what the offense is. So there's a lot of room for creativity and to reassess things, because as we see now, what's happening isn't deterring people and it's not working.
All right, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to give the last question that I have to Teresa, because your work at the Bipartisan Policy Center positions you perfectly for this. How do we start to build a bipartisan coalition around solutions like this? Because a lot of what we've heard today is workable. We know that there are advantages to the country to legalizing the undocumented, but there's not a strong bipartisan coalition around this particular issue. How do we start to build that?
So thank you very much for asking that question. I mean, I think Jeremy mentioned earlier sort of, polling on this issue kind of tends to reinforce the way it's done, what either base wants. But the American public is much more nuanced. They actually want balanced policies. They're not necessarily against legalization, but they also want to see the border enforced. They want to see that the laws we have, or whatever laws we have, do have some value to them and are taken seriously. And I would say legalization means not just providing a way for people already here to get legal, but ensuring that our future immigration comes through mostly legal channels. And interestingly enough, there is more room to build consensus around changes to our legal immigration system than there is on either broad-based legalization or border enforcement only, right? Those are the two policies that are strongest with the basis of each party and have the least room for compromise between the parties. But legal immigration has much more room for that kind of discussion. And the bills that we have seen get the farthest are the ones that frankly deal with legal immigration reform, particularly related to workforce. And that is an area where I think we could build goodwill. One of the biggest problems Congress has right now is the lack of trust among its members. And they find it so hard to trust anybody else. And part of that is the way that negotiations happen. But I do believe that if we could focus on some reforms to the legal immigration system and maybe bringing in some of these corollaries like a 245I, which would allow somebody who already has the eligibility for a legal visa, but for their undocumented status, the ability to access that with a penalty, a fine or something else, is a way to manage those kind of distinct viewpoints. It's a corollary to revising the legal immigration system. But it also, as I mentioned earlier, would address some of the problems of undocumented current migration at the border. If asylum is the only legal avenue available to you, you will use it even if you don't qualify. And that's what we're seeing now. So we need to make real efforts to figure out how do we connect people who are so desperate to migrate with a legal avenue. And asylum may not be the right thing for everybody. In fact, for most of them, they probably don't qualify. But if there were a legal work visa, maybe that's something available to them. So we believe at BPC that we'll see what happens with reconciliation. It will either get done or not done in the next few days, probably. And it's an all or nothing proposition, right? We either get it or we don't. I think that no matter what happens, we need to kind of turn to this because, as I said, whatever happens in reconciliation will be remediation, not reform. And what we really need is reform.
Very well said. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. This was a great discussion. I know I learned a few things and I hope that our viewers did too. So thank you to Teresa and Julia and Larry and Yvonne. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tony. Tony, thank you for having us all here. Between the Baker Institute and the Center for Houston's Future, you guys put on a great event today.
Thank you very much, Laura. It really just remains to thank you, Laura and Brett, for moderating these two great panels. Thank you, Judge KP George of Fort Bend County, for the introductory remarks to this event. Thanks to the audience for all the great questions. And I also want to thank, of course, the Koch Foundation for its support of this important initiative on immigration. All the panelists were great, lots of information, lots to think about. We may not necessarily agree on the contours of an immigration reform and what the immigration system should look like, but we certainly agree that something needs to be done, that the system is broken and it needs to be fixed. It's not serving the demographic interests, the economic interests, and of course, not the political interests of the United States. And that should be kind of a guiding principle for us to take action on immigration. And of course, I want to thank our co-organizers, the Bush Institute in Dallas, and of course, the Center for Houston's Future. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Have a good lunch and have a good day. Bye-bye.